Hello and welcome to Hidden Dusk, a place where the night grows quiet and the shadows begin to tell their stories. Before we begin, dim the lights, get comfortable and relax. And if you enjoy calm and eerie stories like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, let the darkness guide you into tonight's story. I remember the first weeks after my parents bought the house as if they occurred only seconds ago. Even though the ink on those closing papers had dried 14 years before the night, I saw something looking back at me from the broken-out window of the old Williams place. Most newcomers who turn off the state highway and rumble down our little spur of gravel think of it as one long driveway with 4 houses sprinkled like dice coming to rest. There is no county road sign, no speed limit placard, no street lamp to announce you have left pavement and entered our tiny cul-de-sac of family histories. If a stranger is foolish enough to drive past the first cattle guard, dusty oak limbs rake the roof of his truck while the narrow lane herds him downhill, and by the time he reaches the bend he is committed. Backing out is impossible, and the ground is too soft to spin a U-turn without risking an axle-deep rut. For anyone who does press on, the first house he sees on the left belongs to my Uncle A stout white brick rancher with wind chimes on the porch and 3 blue heeler mixes barking behind a chain-link fence. 50 yards downhill, on the same side of the lane, stands the abandoned house my grandparents called the Williams place. It was built in the late 1940s by my great-grandfather's cousin, a carpenter who left for Wyoming and never returned. Over time, termites tunneled the sills, shingles slid from the roof like ice off a thawing pond, and brambles swallowed the front walk. Kids in the county whispered that rattlesnakes denayed in piles of fallen plaster. Mothers warned about tetanus and broken glass. My father, who loved nothing more than repairing what time had ruined, promised he would restore the place someday, but running the sawmill and raising children consumed every ounce of daylight. Drive a little farther and the gravel carries you across a shallow creek bed that runs only in early spring. On the right sits a once white 2-story farmhouse with uneven shutters and a front porch whose floorboards sag under the weight of family barbecues every July. That house belongs to my grandparents, T&L, as they always signed birthday cards, Love, T&L. For my entire childhood, Grandpa's diesel truck snarled awake before dawn, its headlights bobbing up our drive while he hauled seasoned hickory to the kiln on the North Ridge. He taught me to use a drawknife and a measuring tape before I memorized multiplication tables, and he swore the smell of fresh split timber cured head colds and broken hearts alike. Finally, where the lane ends in a short rise and a circle of river stones, you find the house my father built the year I was born. Cedar siding weathered to the color of a whitetail's back, a wind vane shaped like a trout, and a broad back deck cantilevered just enough to peek over the hillside at the endless acres of hardwood bottomland. That is where I live with my father Jay and my grandparents. My mother died before I grew tall enough to pull the front door shut behind me, so the rhythms of my world are mail, chainsaws, rough banter, the click of rifle bolts in November, but softened by Grandma's humming and the sweet tang of molasses cornbread cooling on the sill. I describe the layout because place matters here more than monthly calendars or roadside mile markers. This corner of Virginia is stitched together by bloodlines and dogwood roots. Every bend in the creek owns a story, and every abandoned chimney reminds passers-by that ancestors once chased deer through these laurels, singing hymns that never found their way into books. No single house stands apart. We see one another's porch lights flick on at dawn, watch one another's children toss fireflies into mason jars after supper, and bury one another's dogs beside split-rail fences when the years finally overtake them. All of that geography existed long before the night someone, or something, looked out from the Williams place and turned my insides to water. I was 16 the first time Grandma told me the curse story. We sat side by side on the glider that faced the creek, dusk settling like chimney ash across the pasture. More often than not, she offered gentle tales about doe tracks or the medicinal power of muscadine. But that evening she spoke of things older than fences and harder to fend off than hunger. A native war shaman who wore wolf pelts sewn from his own kin, who called lightning with his whistles, who slipped between man and beast the way others slip between river pools. She said his people realized too late that hunger had hollowed his heart. They cut him down in wolf form and burned the body, but his last breath carried marrow-deep malice, a promise that land and blood would taste his return. It is evil that walks on 2 and 4, she warned, voice lilting in the half-light. And it comes when neighbors forget to watch over neighbors. I laughed, trying to picture a werewolf skulking through the oaks. Dad, loading wood into the pickup, barked, "Ma, quit poisoning her mind with fairy stories." She returned his glare with flint-chip eyes and said nothing more, but I saw sorrow ripple across her face like wind across a catfish pond. After that, she never again told me about curses. She did not need to. The notion took root. Years passed. High school honors classes piled essays onto exams until sleep felt like a rumor I had heard on the bus. I hid behind calculus textbooks, telling myself extra credit was armor. But each grade pulled the pin on a new worry grenade. That September, with college applications closing in, I found myself pacing the back deck long after midnight beneath a moon fat as a carving pumpkin. Winston, our English mastiff, lay sprawled near my chair, one droopy eye half open. At 170 pounds he outweighed most freshman linebackers and snored like an idling tractor. When he chose to stand, Dusk seemed to tilt toward him as if gravity favored muscle. That Monday Winston sprawled as usual, dew forming on his brindled coat. I played a Luke Combs playlist through earbuds, closed my eyes, and let the drums match the panic banging in my ribcage. A neighbor's blue-tick hound started baying down the road, eager, repetitive calls that usually meant a raccoon had wandered near. I pulled one earbud free and hollered toward the sound, "Quiet, Bo!" The hound answered with renewed fury. Winston blinked. Then the forest inhaled. Birdsong ceased mid-chirp. Cicada buzz stuttered to nothing. The hound's voice pitched from complaining yelps to a single high scream that nodded into silence. Winston rose, head low, hackles bristling. In that hush I heard the creek slip across rocks half a mile off, and beneath it something else. Footsteps? No. Weight settling. Mass shifting. My own lungs sounded louder than common sense. I aimed my flashlight toward the tree line. A shape stood half concealed behind a tulip poplar, a column of shadow thicker than the trunk. Too tall for a man, shoulders narrow into elbows that hung below the waist. I remembered every detail later, though. In that instant I froze, finger poised over phone camera but powerless to lift. Winston growled. A deep, resonant vibration, and the shape eased backward. Not turned. Slid. One blink and it was gone. I tried to rationalize. A deer standing on hind legs to nibble persimmon? Silly. A bear? Bears waddle and glint with brown. This silhouette drank light. I gathered Winston and hustled inside. I slept on the living room sofa while he patrolled floorboards from window to window, nose wrinkling at each seam in the evening. 2 nights later my calculus workbook remained unresolved, so I perched at the porch table again, earbuds dulled low. Midnight passed. When cicadas halted this time, I stood before the silence could weigh me down. I set my phone screen down and locked the door behind me. Walked the fence line with Winston pacing 5 steps ahead. No movement, only still air heavy as wool. Dawn-colored light crept through blinds before I dozed. The day bled into chores, school, essays, tractor belts, until rust silence settled again Wednesday. I was gaming in my room around 11:30, volume down, when the cattle bawled. Not the typical low, come feed us rumble, this carried alarm. I grabbed Mom's old 20 gauge from the closet and Winston's collar and jogged across the backyard. The barn's right door hung skewed, metal bent outward. Inside, a Hereford steer lay eviscerated, rib cage torn wide. Blood-drenched cedar shavings, no drag marks, as if something reached inside and removed organs without scooting the body. Coyotes? They nip until hamstrings fail. Mountain lion? Maybe, but prints were elongated, splayed, toes tipped with triangular digs like knife points. I hauled what remained of the steer to the back pasture to bury at first light. Winston refused to follow the tractor, lips quivering, and I swore he muttered in low throat language an animal reserves for its god. Night after night he paced windows. Something patrolled the yard lines too. Thumps on porch planks, a scrape under bedroom sills, faint enough I questioned whether fear invented them. Saturday morning I resolved to trap proof. I dragged the steer's hide, hardening in flies, into that same tangle my grandma once called the gnarly patch. I wired the hide to an iron T-post, angled a trail cam against a forked pine, synced to my phone. Noon heat shimmered as I hauled out. At 1:04 p.m. the phone chirped. Motion triggered. Frame 1. Hide alone. Frame 2. Blur. Frame 3. Creature. I zoomed until pixels fuzzed. Humanoid torso skin stretched too thin, bones etched under soot-gray dermis, arms ending in claws. The head fused deer skull and something reptilian, antlers arching backward, flame-red eyes fixed on gore. I saved the shots, then swore so loud Winston jumped. Dad owned a .30-30 lever-action Winchester. I loaded soft points, strapped on my grandfather's Bowie, and prayed in the hallway, "Lord, steel my nerves." Winston whined. I commanded stay. He obeyed, miserable. Cicadas hushed 200 yards from the gnarly patch. I smelled iron, decay, ammonia. The hide flapped listlessly without breeze. Then breath at my ear, wet, rank. I spun, rifle raised. Nothing but cedar trunks. I stepped backward. Something crashed behind me, then in front. I sensed it circling like a shark in kelp, faster than the human eye. A voice called from left, "Dare Annie." My breath froze. It was my mother's voice, perfect cadence, though she'd been dead 12 years. Voice again from behind, "Come home, baby." I choked on grief and terror. The form manifested 15 feet ahead, stepping between sunshafts, towering, gaunt, hooves occluded by leaf mold, antlers nearly scraped overhanging limbs. It inhaled, ribs expanding, and the deer skull cracked a grin too wide. Crouched. I fired rapid, 8 rounds. Impacts punched black tar from its torso. The stench curdled air. It shrieked. Multi-voiced harmony of my father, Sarah from choir, even my own shout, layered until eardrums rang. It lurched, then dashed downslope, limbs a blur, impossible speed. I chambered the 9th, fired into its back. It stumbled, toppled through dry briars. The hillside shook. I advanced, heart drilling, until I reached the ravine lip. Silence. No body. Only broken branches and viscous black droplets evaporating like morning frost. I limped home, showered blood off my arms. Some mine from briar cuts, some unknown and stinking of copper and sulfur. Winston licked my knuckles as if washing away confession. I texted Tom and Sarah that my Saturday plans were canceled. I offered no reason. The next week wildlife returned. Birds gossiped at dawn. Fox kits tussled near the compost heap, and even deer tiptoed across soybean sprouts. I meant to delete the trail cam photos but couldn't. For days I considered sending them to cryptid forums, to museum specialists, to Dad in a panicked call. Instead I copied to a hidden drive labeled tax records and buried the stick beneath loose floorboards in my closet. 2 weeks later Uncle came down the lane in his Ram, dogs baying in excitement. He unloaded feed sacks, then paused at the tailgate, eyes narrowed toward the Williams place. "Saw lights inside last night," he muttered. "Kids again." I swallowed. "Haven't heard." He spat a sunflower seed husk. "You keep that rifle close." That evening I sat on the porch, scanning the abandoned house, remembering its cracked window. Moonlight slicked the broken panes. For a heartbeat I saw a silhouette bend in the same unnatural stoop. Red eyes glowed, then blinked out. I cocked the hammer. The shape retreated deeper than glass. I held breath until Winston nudged my knee, whining. The yard light blinked, fluttered, and steadied. Grandma found me at sunrise dozing against the porch post. She brewed chicory coffee, poured a tin mug, and placed it near my knee. "Eyes open late?" she asked. I considered lying, but the weight of memory pressed words true. "I think the old stories are back." She nodded as if I confirmed weather. "Land remembers," she said. "Evil don't die, just changes shoes." She reached inside her shawl, produced a leather pouch heavy with braided sweetgrass and bone beads. "Burn this in 4 corners of the yard at sundown. Say Psalm 91. If it leaves, good. If not, you call your uncle and he'll bring friends." She patted my shoulder, gaze fierce. "You're a McPherson. You stand guard." Then she added softer, "But you don't stand alone. I burned the bundle that night. Smoke smelled of resin and thunderstorms. I spoke the psalm. Winston howled each amen. Whether prayer or lead scored victory I cannot claim, but the Williams place has remained empty since. Occasionally the dogs bristle and stare toward the treeline, and sometimes I glimpse new claw scars on cedar trunks, higher than any bear could reach. I never retrieved the trail cam. When brambles brown in winter, I may hike in and see if batteries died. But part of me hopes memory is the only evidence left. I deleted those occult books from my shelves. Cravings to speak certain forgotten names evaporated like that black tar under sunlight. Tom and Sarah still invite me on midnight hikes. I decline with a smile and hand them a printed map, insisting daylight offers prettier views. They joke I've turned superstitious. Maybe so. But I know the thing wearing a deer skull is heavier than superstition. It is hunger shaped like bone and shadow, and it seeks lonely hearts beating fast in tangled woods. My heart still beats, but not alone. The porch light glows each dusk, my family within earshot, and Winston's deep bark prowls the dark. If the creature ever leans through the Williams window again, it will find my rifle sight lined on those ember eyes, and behind that barrel, a ranch bloodline ready to remind evil that land chooses its own guardians. Enter the shadows with us. Like, subscribe, and keep the nightmares coming on Hidden Dusk. Candle. The question froze her heart harder than any bullet. She wanted to kneel, to surrender her pulse. But something, perhaps faith learned from childhood, jerked her muscles. She spun toward the adjacent trench network. Mud sucked at her boots. She stumbled, caught herself, flung aside discarded rifles as she fled. The monstrous laugh trailed behind her, a sound of rusted gates screaming on dry hinges. She scrambled up the trench ladder onto open ground. The creature pressed close. She felt its breath on her neck, though she dared not look over her shoulder. Machine gun fire rattled somewhere distant, another section of front. Shells whispered across the sky. But here in no man's land, only her ragged breathing and the crackle of burnt corpses filled the dark. Something struck her shoulder like a hammer. She pitched forward into mud, rolled onto her back, expecting to see claws. Instead, she spotted a shard of shrapnel lodged in her uniform. Blood soaked through, hot and strangely comforting because it proved she was still flesh, still real. She must have crawled for hours, though she remembered only fragments. Dead faces in the dirt, the creeping fog behind her, the weight of unseen eyes. Eventually she reached what had been the German front-line trench. No voices, only tattered sandbags. She dropped into a dugout, slammed the wooden door, and braced her spine against the far wall. A lantern sat on an ammunition crate. Her shaking hands found a match and struck flame. Yellow light revealed an officer's body folded over a map table. She tried to stanch her shoulder with ripped cloth, then curled beside the corpse, knees to chest, lamp glowing at her feet. She lifted the pistol from the dead man's belt. Not for defense, but because holding it felt like clinging to the last branch above a waterfall. Time lost meaning. Minutes stretched like hours. At some point she watched mildew creep over the officer's sleeves. Flesh puckered, blackened, and crumbled in silence. In less than a minute, the whole body withered to gray powder that drifted into a crack in the floor. No rot smell, only dust. Panic threatened to snap her mind, but a survivor's instinct kept her finger on the pistol trigger. When heavy boots thudded against the bunker door, she fired wildly, emptying the magazine. Even as she squeezed each round, she knew the bullets would not stop what hunted her. But terror ruled reason. The latch burst open. White sunlight speared her eyes. A German sergeant, not the monster, filled the doorway, rifle leveled, shouting her name. She kept pulling the trigger until the sergeant knocked the pistol aside and caught her trembling shoulders. Reinforcements finally had reached the sector. They found no living medical staff, no wounded men left in beds, only uniforms crumpled like paper, bones fused with ash. They carried my grandmother to a rear hospital where surgeons dug the shrapnel from her shoulder. The 3 lumps beneath her wrist they could not explain. They looked like calcified nodes. They caused excruciating pain when touched. Doctors called them nerve tumors, though none had seen that pattern. Weeks later, the army sent her to Posen, to her grandmother's cottage far from the trenches. She did not speak for nearly a month, barely ate for days at a stretch. Only when her husband, my future grandfather, obtained leave and knelt by her bedside did she finally tell fragments of what she had seen. A military tribunal recorded her testimony, then stamped it nervous collapse and dismissed the file. She was discharged with a diagnosis of shell shock and assigned to help during the influenza pandemic of 1918. Whenever fevers spiked patients' skin, she smelled again the creature's breath. Severe nightmares plagued her. Doctors later labeled her condition schizophrenia. She tried to serve again during the Russo-Polish conflict in 1920, but recurring visions forced her into a sanatorium. She married, bore children, outlived 2 sons, and eventually settled in Bavaria. She lived to 110, but never described the October fog aloud until the final year of her life, when senility loosened memories. She spoke in half German, half Polish whispers, telling me the story as if I were still a child on her knee. She swore every word to be true. I watched her fingertips trace the faint triangle beneath the skin of her wrist, marks that never faded. Years later, I searched military archives. Of 3 people recorded as survivors of that field hospital, 1 disappeared near the old site in 1923. Another died in the Nazi camp at Zaslau in 1940. The third, my grandmother, carried her terror to the grave. Modern maps show the forest sector closed to public entry. Documents cite unexploded ordnance and ground contamination. Yet local rumors speak of missing hikers and inexplicable fires. Official patrols keep boundaries tight. Nobody goes in, nobody comes out. Say what you will. Believe or deny. But the marks in her wrist were real. The medical records indicate 90 men vanished in a single night, and the land itself still hides the truth behind fog thick enough to smother a scream. I was born and raised on a working ranch in the open country of west-central Texas, a place where the wind carries the smell of sun-bleached grass, mesquite smoke, and fresh manure. My family had owned that land for as long as anyone in town could remember. The property stretched over rolling pasture, small creek beds, and a thick, crescent-shaped patch of oak and juniper that everyone simply called the woods. Our cattle roamed the fences. Our horses were our daily partners. Most evenings ended with tools clanking in the barn, the satisfied snort of tired geldings, and coyotes yipping at the sunset. Growing up, I learned how to ride before I could reach a truck's brake pedal. I fixed fence, tossed bales, wormed calves, and felt certain the ranch lay under my skin the way red dust settles permanently into old leather. By the summer I turned 22. My older brother and sister had long since moved off the land. They built lives in Austin and Amarillo and came home only for holidays. That left me living with my parents in the old adobe brick house near the windmill. I slept beneath the same tin roof my great-grandfather had hammered down and followed the same work rhythms he once did. Suited me fine. So when my parents surprised me with news that they were taking their first real vacation, an autumn week in France to celebrate 25 years of marriage, I did not blink at their request that I watch the ranch alone. Dad trusted me with the livestock. He knew I could keep the generator fueled if the power blinked and call the vet if a cow went down. He left a handwritten list on the kitchen table. Double-lock the mare barn each evening, check the water trough in the south pasture at dawn, keep an eye on the pregnant heifer near the north gate. Mom filled the freezer with casseroles and kissed my cheek. Then they drove off toward the airport, waving through the dusty windshield, and I felt a quiet pride settle in my chest. A week of responsibility, solitude, and the crisp promise of early fall. The first 2 days passed exactly as any rancher hopes. Clear mornings, calm horses, no broken fences, and no signs of coyotes near the calves. On day 2, my girlfriend, Liz, drove up from San Angelo. We spent the warm afternoon riding our quarter horses to the back pond. Dragonflies skated over the water, frogs croaked in the cattails, and cotton clouds stacked on the horizon like someone's Sunday laundry. Liz teased that my face already carried more sun than sense. We hauled a few catfish onto the bank, splashed each other, and rode home by the faint orange glow of a harvest moon. That night I locked every stall, slid the heavy barn doors together, and ran my hand along the timbers like Dad always did to make sure each latch held. A gentle breeze rattled the oak leaves at the tree line behind the outbuildings, and crickets sang from dry grass. Everything felt normal until, for a few seconds, the entire night fell still. No wind, no insects, not even the slow crack of cooling tin on the roof. I stood in the yard, pulse thudding, convinced someone watched me from the dark tangle of juniper 100 yards away. But when I aimed my flashlight toward the trunks, the beam caught nothing except dust motes. I told myself the hush was only that brief eerie silence you sometimes notice just before a train whistle or owl call, and I headed inside. The third day slid by much the same. Liz drove back to town for work, and I worked through Dad's checklist, fixed a leaky hose, and doctored a small cut on one of the geldings. Heat shimmered over the pasture after noon, and by supper time I was ready for a shower and bed. I curled on the worn leather sofa, boots off, listening to an old Merle Haggard record at low volume, repeating to myself that life was good. Sometime near midnight, a faint cry reached my half-dreaming ears. A single, lonely howl cresting the pasture from the woods behind the barn. Coyotes sing out here almost every night, but the ranch rarely hears a lone voice. They yip and chatter in packs, weaving high-pitched calls like a chorus. This sound was different. It rose in a long, slow swell, deeper than any coyote, then faded in a lazy tail. A www. A recording could not have produced a steadier pitch. My skin prickled, but I rolled over, convinced it was a distant stray dog or some rusted hinge groaning in the wind. Just before dawn, I woke again, heart pounding. The house felt sweltering. I padded to the bathroom, splashed cool water on my face, and headed to the box fan near the bedroom window. As I reached for the switch, the howl returned, closer this time, so close it vibrated the clapboard wall. AWWWOO. My stomach squeezed tight. I stepped to the window and lifted the edge of the curtain. Moonlight washed the barnyard silver. Nothing moved, yet the sound floated through the night air again. AWWW. The voice came from the exact distance of the barn door. I grabbed Dad's old lever-action rifle from the corner and thumbed the safety off. I was not naive about predators. Bobcats sometimes wandered down from the higher mesas, though rarely this near the house. But the tone behind that cry felt wrong, smarter, deliberate. For several minutes silence returned, broken only by my thumping pulse and the rhythmic whir of the fan I had finally turned on. Then came heavy footsteps crunching gravel outside the back of the house. Slow, deliberate, too weighty to be a raccoon or fox. A shape crossed the moonlit yard. I dropped the curtain and slid under the quilt like a frightened child. Rifle barrel resting on the mattress, my index finger taut against the trigger guard. A sliver of sheet remained over my eyes, but I could not make myself look out. Another howl, longer, louder, stretching from deep chest notes to a shrill echo, and then total quiet. Sometime near sunrise birdsong pulled me from uneasy sleep. I pushed aside the quilt, stepped into my boots, and crept onto the porch. The barn door hung wide open, one metal hinge twisted. Inside, manure stirred by cattle footprints was scattered strangely, as if the herd had spun in tight circles. In the corner lay a heifer, throat torn open, ribs broken like snapped fence pickets. I gagged. Flies already crawled across the wound. No claw marks from coyotes. The flesh looked shredded by hands. Shock gave way to anger. This was my parents' livelihood, and I had promised to protect it. My mind flashed back to the figure I imagined in the trees 2 nights earlier. Some crazed drifter, a rabid dog, or worse, something unthinking, something unnatural. I pushed that last thought aside. Whatever it was, it had already killed once, and either I ended it or it would keep killing. I hauled the carcass to the edge of the woods with the tractor, sweat gluing my shirt to my back even in the cool morning. Buzzards would have found it anyway, but now I had another plan. Bait. If the killer returned for fresh meat, I meant to be ready. I mounted Dad's trail camera on a cedar post overlooking the dead heifer, aimed so it would send photos to my phone the moment motion triggered the sensor. Then I spent the afternoon cleaning the barn, repairing the hinge, moving cows to the far pasture, and checking the rifle's magazine one more time. Each chore felt like a thin defense against something unknown. Dusk spread purple over the horizon. Crickets started up again, braver than the night before. I ate a sandwich in silence, eyes on the phone. At 9:23 p.m., the first picture arrived. I almost dropped the device. The grainy shot revealed a tall outline beside the carcass. At least 8 feet high, shoulders hunched, limbs so long the hands brushed knees. The shape looked partly transparent, as if smoke formed its edges. A hood of matted fur or hair hung over where a face should be. Another photo followed seconds later. The figure lowered toward the carcass, 2 ropes of what looked like tongue unfurling past jagged teeth. My stomach lurched. The final image froze me. The creature lifted its head, eyes burning red, fixed directly on the camera. I slammed the screen dark. Every part of me wanted to bolt for the pickup, drive until dawn, and never look back. But that would mean losing the ranch to this thing. I whispered a prayer, loaded fresh cartridges into the rifle, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped onto the porch. The night air felt thicker than wool, humid in a way Texas nights rarely do. My boots crunched over dry grass. The closer I came to the tree line, the heavier my breath seemed, as if heat pressed from every side. Inside the woods, the flashlight beam bounced off trunks, branches, dew-soaked spider webs. Each crackle of the underbrush jerked my aim. Somewhere ahead, the stench of rot thickened. A sharp, metallic tang floated on the humid air, copper and decay. I eased the rifle into my shoulder. Then silence. Utter, perfect silence. Even my heartbeat dulled, swallowed by the hush. I realized the beam had landed on something pale where it should have found bark. A hand hovered at chest height, fingers twice as long as mine, tipped with black points. Above the hand, a gaunt skull peered from the hood. No skin left on the cheeks, just lacquered bone, with 2 dark hollows for eyes that nonetheless burned from somewhere deeper than flesh. The creature stood so close my breath fogged the front sight of the rifle. I squeezed the trigger. The blast lit the trunks like lightning. The thing jerked, smoke swirling through its ribs, but it kept advancing. I fired again, walking backward, lever clacking, brass casings flashing in the light before vanishing into leaves. With each shot it staggered yet repaired itself. Holes closed as if the body were memory rather than matter. I tripped over a root and bruised my tailbone hard. The rifle clattered beside me. The monster leaned down, one forked tongue lapping blood from the heifer still clinging to its chin. A hiss reached my ears, a whisper more than a roar, but the words felt carved into my skull. Run, boy. I scooped the rifle, scrambled to my feet, and ran. Branches whipped my face. The path from the house to the woods felt twice as long on the return. Moonlight flickered between limbs like strobes. Behind me the creature's strides crashed, each footfall cracking branches thicker than broom handles. Yet it never overtook me. It herded me, steering me with angled steps, corralling me toward the open barn door glowing under a single bulb. Somehow I reached the threshold, hurled my body inside, and shoved the metal doors together. A claw scraped down the outside in a long screech. Dust rained from rafters. The cows inside stampeded into the far corner, bawling. Minutes passed. The doors stayed closed. Nothing moved outside. I slid a hay bale against the latch and backed away, rifle still leveled. Night drifted toward dawn. Eventually fatigue pinned my eyelids shut as I leaned against the tackroom wall. At sunrise I forced the doors open. No claw marks remained on the steel. No footprints dented the dirt. The tree line looked peaceful, same as always. But my phone chimed one final trail cam image. In it, the creature stood at the barnyard fence, watching the house, one claw extended toward the lens as if promising return. Later that morning I phoned Dad overseas. Air crackled between continents. I tried to describe what I had fought, but words felt childish. Dad listened, silent. Finally he told me he believed I had defended the ranch the only way I could. Sometimes you stand your ground, he said. Even when the ground ain't natural. I buried the heifer's remains beyond the creek, far from the living herd. I never saw the creature again. I never stopped carrying a weapon when I entered the woods. And every time I lock the barn at night, I pause, let the crickets sing, and wait for silence. or for a lone, slow howl that never quite comes. I was 28 when Scott, my best friend, invited me and his 18-year-old son David out for our annual all-night fishing trip. Every August we loaded our tackle into Scott's old half-ton Chevy, drove the winding roads north of Martinsville, Indiana, and slipped down the rutted trail to the far side of Morgan Monroe Reservoir. We called that shoreline our spot. Thick hardwoods pressed right to the water's edge, and the cove was always mirror-still under the moon. We'd settle on folding chairs, sling bait into the black water, and talk about engines, work, and whatever else drifted to the surface. Scott and I had met 10 years earlier in a machine shop. Over time, he became more brother than friend. I was at his house most weekends, ate his wife's pot roast on Sundays, and watched his 3 kids grow from toddlers to teenagers. David, the oldest, was starting his senior year, itching to leave small-town Indiana behind. On the drive, we joked that fishing might be the last wholesome habit he'd carry into adulthood. We should have reached the reservoir just after 6, but I'd forgotten to buy bait. Scott rolled his eyes the way only a man who's disappointed in you for the 100th time can, then swung into a gas and bait shack on the outskirts of town. We grabbed worms, chicken liver, a coffee for me, an energy drink for David, and a can of chew for Scott. The sun hovered orange above the tree line when we finally bumped the truck off the gravel road and parked in the tall grass beside a hand-painted sign that read closed, "Animal Attack." The 3 of us stared. Scott ran a thumb over his mustache, half amused, half irritated. "Probably some idiot's idea of a joke," he said. Still, he and I kept pistols holstered beneath our jackets, same as always. We hiked the quarter-mile trail, flashlights bobbing over tree trunks, and reached the familiar clearing where limestone slabs spilled almost to the water. By 8 we had lines in, a small fire crackling, and friendly bets on who'd haul the first catfish. The woods cooled. Bullfrogs traded calls across the cove. Our laughter settled into low conversation, little more than background to the steady chirr of insects. About 10, David ducked into the trees to relieve himself. I tossed him a flashlight and reminded him the lake-bordered state forest for miles. Less than a minute after he vanished, a sharp wooden knock echoed from deeper in the trees. Then another. Each strike was deliberate, like a heavy branch pounded against a trunk. Knock, knock, knock. I barked David's name. He called back, confused. "It's not me," he said, voice already closer as he picked a path through the brush. He reached the fire, cheeks flushed. Nearly as soon as he stepped into the light, a new barrage of knocks erupted farther off. Louder now, almost impatient. Scott snapped, "Cut the nonsense, kid." David swore he hadn't left the trail. Suddenly a rock the size of a softball sailed from the darkness and thudded into the dirt beside our camp chairs. All 3 of us jumped. I flicked my light into the trees but saw only layered shadows. We calmed ourselves by naming ordinary possibilities. A foraging raccoon dislodging stones. A mischievous bowhunter retreating to a tree stand. But none of us truly believed it. Just after midnight, a second rock, bigger, 6 or 7 pounds, hurtled from the forest. It splashed into the lake, sending water over our boots. Scott stood, flashlight sweeping. Between 2 oaks perhaps 40 yards away hung a silhouette, impossibly tall, broad across the shoulders, yet slender in the limbs. Its eyes glinted reddish-yellow in the beam, reflecting like a deer's but set far higher than any deer's head should be. David whispered, "Dad?" and stepped back. Scott chambered a round in his pistol but didn't raise it. The figure slipped behind a trunk and disappeared. Silence returned, amplified by our pounding hearts. We agreed without words it was time to leave. We snapped glow sticks onto our rod tips to mark their place, packed the cooler and shouldered tackle boxes. As soon as we started up the trail, a branch cracked behind us. Something was pacing. Knock-knock smashed through the night, now from the left side of the trail, then the right, then somewhere ahead. A boulder. There's no lighter word. Crashed through limbs, thudded 10 feet behind us, and rolled to our feet. My chest seized. David gasped. That sign wasn't a joke. We broke into a trot, hampered by gear and darkness. Halfway to the truck, an ungodly screech shredded the air. a blend of elk bugle and human scream, cut off as suddenly as it began. Next came steady footfalls, massive, deliberate, paralleling the trail. Leaves rattled where something tall brushed through lower branches. At the trailhead, the Chevy's windows glittered like crushed ice under our lights, shattered inward. The bed's corrugated metal bore a deep dent. A bloody, mangled raccoon lay across the tailgate. Its back snapped and ribcage split. Steam drifted from the carcass even in the warm night air. Scott unlocked the doors. We scrambled inside. When the headlights flared, the creature stepped from behind a sycamore into full view. It loomed at least 7 feet, maybe more, hair dark brown verging on black, shoulders canted forward like a sprinter on blocks. Its arms reached mid-thigh. The head reminded me of no animal I'd ever seen. Vaguely canine, yet broader, with a long muzzle and small triangular ears pinned back. Those ember eyes caught the high beams and flared. Scott threw the truck in reverse. Gravel spit. The beast advanced a single pace and swung an arm. A melon-sized stone hissed through the air and struck the tailgate with a metallic boom that jolted us down the seats. Then the creature dropped to all fours and loped into the trees, vanishing beyond the halo of headlights. We didn't slow until Martinsville's first streetlight slid across the windshield. No one spoke. In Scott's driveway, we stepped out to inspect the damage. For windows blown in, rock in the bed, claw-like scratches scored through paint. At first, Scott's wife thought drink and ditch had wrecked the truck. My own wife laughed when I tried explaining over the phone. But I know what I saw. Something ancient, powerful, and territorial prowling those Indiana woods. The state eventually reopened that trail. Scott sold the Chevy to a scrapyard and bought a new one, installed metal mesh guards over the rear window before he'd even left the dealership. David finished high school, moved to Indianapolis, and hasn't fished that reservoir since. Me? I still camp and cast lines under moonlight, but never again in that cove. And every August when humid night air settles over hardwoods, I remember amber eyes, tree-shattering knocks, and a scream too wild for any earthly throat. I was 14 the summer my cousin M and I turned my grandfather's half-finished tin house into what we proudly called our clubhouse. Grandpa had started the place years earlier, after Grandma died, hoping to live out his days in a single-floor open-plan home that sat halfway up the ridge on our family's 150 Kentucky acres. By the time the walls were up, however, his health had failed, and the structure stood unused. 4 tin sides, a roof, concrete slab, half-wired, half-plumbed, empty. It squatted just a couple hundred yards above the county road. A ribbon of chip seal twisting through pure Daniel Boone forest, but it still felt buried in wilderness. We reached it by putting the truck in 4-low, winding up a mud track, then hiking the last steep stretch on foot. The bones of a small stable stood on one flank. On the other side, the trees thickened into a deep, dark wall of oak and hickory that joined thousands of national forest acres. During the school year, M and I rode the bus, pushed mowers, chased dogs, and talked about engines, skating, paintball, girls. That summer, neither of us had a driver's license yet, so our county line might as well have been the edge of the earth. The clubhouse became freedom. We patched a half-pipe together from scavenged plywood, dragged pallets and barrels into the woods to build bunkers, and unofficially declared the slope behind the tin walls a paintball field. Friday afternoons we jammed our rucksacks with soda and sandwiches, hauled our paintball guns and skates up the hill, rolled the big padlock open with a satisfying clack, and locked ourselves into our own kingdom. One Friday late in July, the heat lay over the valley like wet wool. School felt exactly one universe away. M met me at the edge of the gravel lot where the logging road began. We slung gear into the old garden cart, paintball markers, 2 500-count bags of yellow and blue paint, a cooler, a tarp, skate tools, duct tape, a milk crate full of nails, and trudged up the ruddy climb, sweat pooling under ball caps, cicadas screaming. As usual, we worked till dusk building barriers. We nailed plywood between 2 sassafras trunks, turned a rotten hay feeder upside down for a fort, and trimmed brush so you could sprint from half-pipe to bunker without snagging your hopper. Past the clearing, the ridge dropped hard toward the creek. Dense beech and poplar kept that slope permanently twilight. We'd never ventured far into it. From down there, somewhere beyond sight, You heard a constant whisper of water over rock. When sunset crept across the tin walls, we hammered in a last nail, dragged dead limbs to the fire ring, and lit a blaze that snapped and hissed. We poked hot dogs on wire coat hangers, burned them black on the outside and raw in the middle, laughed it off like boys do. I propped my dad's .22 rifle against a pallet, and cackled about a paintball match scheduled tomorrow. He swore he'd smoke me before lunch. I said he'd be the one picking blue splatter out of his ears. We passed a 2-liter of Mountain Dew and belched into the quiet air. That was when the woods behind us made their first sound. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Slow, deliberate footfalls on leaf mold. Both of us went still. Only a thin corrugated wall and 12 feet of scrub separated our backs from the tree line. We pretended not to hear and kept roasting dogs, but the toes of my sneakers twitched restlessly in the dust. Might be a deer, Em offered, although we both knew deer moved lighter than that. The crunching ceased. We exhaled. Then the smell reached us. Stink of wet dog rolled in roadkill, sweet and rotten at the same time. I gagged. Em swore softly and dragged his shirt collar over his nose. A breeze must have shifted to carry it from the hollow. "All right, I'm not sitting in this," he muttered. He grabbed a flashlight from the cooler. "Hold up," I said. I didn't like the idea of him marching blind into the brush, even with a light. "Let's give it a minute." We forced another swallow of soda, but the odor thickened, heavy as sour milk. Em clicked the beam on and swept it across brambles. Yellow light glinted off something deep in the brush. Maybe eyes, maybe nothing. We couldn't tell. "I'm over it." Em tightened his grip on the light, shouldered past the plywood wall, and vanished into the trees. I rose halfway, thinking to follow, then sat again. The rifle rested against the pallet by my elbow. Rabbits bounced through these woods at night. Rustles happened. This was fine. 10 seconds later, the forest exploded. Something crashed through saplings like a wrecking ball. Branches snapped. I leaped to my feet, rifle in hand, just as Em burst back into the clearing, panting, eyes huge. He spilled sideways, plowed through embers, kicked red sparks over the dirt, and scrambled upright. "What?" I shouted. He shook his head, speechless, pointing. Behind him trees thrashed and the smell hit again. Stronger, riding a breath of warm, wet air. A shape brushed the flood of moonlight. Taller than a man, broad across the shoulders, then gone. My stomach turned liquid and backed toward me until our shoulders touched. He whispered, "Not a deer, not a black bear." We stared at the dark corner of the tin wall, waiting for whatever lived in those shadows to materialize. Silence clamped down. No cicadas, no leaf rustle, nothing but our lungs and the pop of sap in logs. In that silence, a hollow wooden knock rang out behind the wall. Bang! Another, lower bang. Em dropped the flashlight. I fumbled around into the .22's chamber. My thumb trembled on the safety, but before I flipped it off, something hammered into the corrugated wall with a metallic gong. The sheet flexed in, popped out. Another blow crashed into the panel. Dust trickled from the roof seam. A third strike caved metal 2 inches deep. Then the night filled with a different sound. An impossible, primal bellow, half roar, half scream, erupting from just beyond the tin. The noise vibrated my teeth. Instinct flooded in flee. Em grabbed my arm and we bolted. We shouldered through brush, churning downhill along the narrow footpath by memory alone. A rock rolled under my heel. I pitched forward, skidded on my stomach, tore my palms. Adrenaline hauled me upright before pain registered. Behind us something barreled through undergrowth. Limbs tearing, trunks splintering. The roar rose again, closer. Em shouted a wordless cry. The path spit us into the old trailer clearing, now just weeds and broken blocks, lit weakly by a single mercury lamp on a crooked pole. We sprinted across yellow light to the gravel drive, turned onto the 2-lane, and ran. Blacktop underfoot, telephone wires overhead, nothing but whipping wind in our ears. I have never matched Em's speed in sneakers before or since. That night I kept pace stride for stride. At Grandma's abandoned farmhouse, a quarter-mile down, My aunt and uncle rented rooms. Porch lights glared white. We vaulted the sagging picket fence, sprinted up the steps, tore through the screen door into a living room full of startled family. My aunt held a soup ladle. My uncle sat with a Bowie knife and whetstone. Both cousins lay watching TV. All four stared as Em and I slammed the door, gasping. We tried explaining. Something huge, the smell, the pounding on tin. My words tangled. Adrenaline still danced in my veins. My uncle pinched the bridge of his nose, sighed. Boys, black bears wander these mountains. You spooked one is all. He offered a wry grin, clicked his tongue. My cousin A elbowed the other cousin, whispered something about Day Ridge monster and laughed. I called Dad from the kitchen phone. He arrived in the pickup 15 minutes later and drove us home. 2 miles, straight shot. Neither Em nor I closed an eye before dawn. While the house slept, we whispered across my room, replaying every crunch, every scream. We convinced ourselves it must have been a bear after all. Bears could stand, could shove tin, could stink like carrion. It was 3 days before we worked up nerve enough to retrieve our bikes and gear. Dad came with us, a 12-gauge in hand. The garden cart lay overturned. Our mountain bikes were 20 feet into the woods, tires tangled in vine. The cooler was gone. The log where we roasted dogs had been snapped, jagged ends pointing to the sky. 3 rounded dents marred the tin wall where something had punched it. At the back door 4 gouges scored the metal, deep, evenly spaced, running from shoulder height to ankle. Dad eyed the marks, silent. We gathered everything fast, loaded the bikes in the truck, and rolled downhill. Em never set foot on that slope again. I avoided it for years. Eventually I built a house where the old trailer used to sit. My kids play under that same street lamp. The ridge above still erupts with strange yowls some nights. Far-off knocks echo through hollows. When dusk paints the trees purple, I bring the children inside and lock the door, remembering the crash of something enormous ripping through a pine thicket, remembering breath that smelled like rot and fear. I was 14 the summer it happened, and if you had asked me back then what I loved most in the world, I would have answered without a pause. Broad Hill. The ridge started behind my grandmother's farmhouse, rose for half a mile, then rolled along the skyline like the back of a sleeping dragon before diving into the greater wilderness of Daniel Boone National Forest. Our family owned a slice of that ridge, 150 scraggly acres that my great-grandfather had bought cheap after the timbermen cleared out. The lower slopes were scrub and sassafras and dog hobble, but farther up you met hickory and white oak that had somehow escaped the saw. To me it was the edge of the known world, a place where ordinary rules got thin, where you could pretend you were the first boy ever to climb a particular steep and look down at the green waves below. Grandpa had loved the ridge too. When I was 6, he began building himself what he called a retirement cabin. Though he never called it a cabin to anyone but me. To everyone else it was just, the place I'm puttin' together up yonder. He framed a single big rectangle on a concrete slab, planted 4x6s every 4 feet, bolted on a corrugated metal roof, and sheeted the walls in salvage tin. There were no interior partitions, just a big bare room with 2 window holes and a door hole that never got a door. Grandpa roughed in a stub of copper pipe for a wood stove chimney, strung a few wires that he intended to connect to a generator, then fell sick and never lifted a hammer again. By the time I finished 5th grade, he had moved to the front bedroom in Grandma's house, where emphysema wheezed him down to skin and bones, and the tin house halfway up Broad Hill stood empty except for a swaying bench he'd built out of slab wood. Even in its half-finished state, the place fascinated me. That galvanized shell sat exactly where the tree line broke and the hillside meadow began. When sunlight hit the metal it flashed like water, and when storm clouds rolled overhead it turned the color of wet slate. Winds whistled through nail holes so that sometimes, if you balanced quiet, you could imagine you were inside the hull of a great steel ship plowing through waves. But the best part was the inside. Tin walls leaked daylight through hundreds of tiny cracks so you could see every mote of dust floating in sunbeams. Grass sprouted around the slab edges and mice built nests of shredded newspaper in the corners. Nobody bothered to lock anything up there because nobody ever came that way except family. Grandpa died when I was 9, and I imagined that the cabin died with him. No one in the family had interest in completing it or tearing it down, so the shell just sat and weathered. At first I was afraid to go inside alone. When thunder shook, tin rattled and popped like gunshots. Sometimes I thought I heard voices in the wind slipping through cracks and thought maybe Grandpa's lungs had left pieces of breath inside. But after a while such notions faded, replaced by the simple wonder of a place that belonged to no grown-ups. I spent that whole next summer playing in the timber behind Grandma's while Dad mowed hay in the bottoms. I would climb the switchback trail to the slab and shuffle leaves around, pretending that carved stumps were cooking stoves, that mossy stones were treasure chests. By age 12, I came to know every knothole in the wall and every rock on the slab. Then came Cousin M. M was 3 months younger than I and lived the next county over. His folks worked second shift in the aluminum plant and let him stay with Grandma most weekends so he wouldn't be alone at night. We were more brothers than cousins. Same bus stop, same ball teams, same scraped knees and muddy sneakers. We traded baseball cards and argued about superhero movies and swapped BB guns back and forth so many times we both forgot which gun was whose. If I loved Broad Hill, M worshipped it. He talked about building a tree fort up there, adding windows, screen doors, a paintball target range, a skate halfpipe. He was the dreamer. I was the planner. 2 summers later we were old enough, just turning 14, to decide we would finally claim the tin house as our personal fortress. It was the 3rd Friday of June, school out exactly 1 week, when we began. We rolled a cracked wheelbarrow up the mountain loaded with what we considered essential carpentry tools. A dull claw hammer, a coffee can of bent nails salvaged from Dad's junk pile, 2 rusty pry bars, a brace and bit, 3 broken yard rakes, and an orange snow shovel handle that we intended to serve as flagpole. Each of us wore a National Guard backpack that belonged to uncles who had served in Desert Storm, and inside those packs we stuffed bottle rockets, paperback fantasy novels, a loaf of sandwich bread, summer sausages, mustard packets, and a shared bag of pork rinds. If the packs dug ruts in our collarbones on that half-mile slog, nobody said so. By lunch we had swept mouse droppings into piles and shoveled them outside. We tore up a half-dozen floor splinters with the pry bars. We tilted Grandpa's slabwood bench upright and nailed on 2 extra boards so both of us could sit without sliding off. At noon we lay on our stomachs at the slab's edge, chins on folded arms, and stared down the slope at Grandma's picket fence shining under the ruthless Kentucky sun. Bone-white clouds drifted overhead. Cicadas whined like turbochargers. Life felt endlessly wide. It was M who first suggested building a half-pipe for skate practice. He sketched plans in the dust with a stick while I tried to work out how much plywood would bend without cracking. We argued about angles, agreed on mounting pallets together for the base. All afternoon we tramped old logging roads searching scrap timber. We upended a shattered cattle gate buried in kudzu, sawed it into planks, and dragged them upslope. We hammered until nails bent double, cursed, hammered again, cheered every time a board stuck. That evening, sweat streaking our foreheads, bug bites crusting our legs, we tested the ramp with M's skateboard. It didn't break. Good enough. We christened our fortress Fort Tin and swore a solemn oath. Every Friday night, barring tornado or parental decree, we would bivouac on Broad Hill and expand the outpost. Most early summer nights in those hills hum with katydids so loud you can hardly think. Around 9:30 that inaugural Friday we built a campfire in the yard between the tin wall and the first line of oaks. We split fence planks for kindling and roasted hot dogs on straightened wire hangers. Fireflies bobbed above grass. The forest sang at full volume, background music for a campfire boasting session in which each of us elaborated what summer might bring. A quarter pipe with coping, a paintball field complete with plywood bunkers, benches built from cedar logs, maybe even a battery-powered fridge for cold Mountain Dew. Our little empire seemed limitless. I remember the precise moment when everything changed. M was midway through a vivid retelling of his greatest skate park wipeout. His voice pitched high, hands slicing the air, when suddenly he cut off mid-word. I hadn't heard what distracted him because in that same instant I noticed the sound. A silence so sudden it had weight. Cicadas, frogs, whip-poor wills. Every living instrument in that nighttime orchestra fell mute. The absence hit like a vacuum. All I could hear was blood thrumming in my ears and the brittle crack of the fire flexing. M turned slowly toward the uphill tree line, eyes wide. I tasted tin on my tongue. Before either of us spoke, something stepped on a branch behind the tin wall. Crunch. Another step. Crunch. Leaves rustled heavily, not skittish like a squirrel, but deliberate. A footfall planted on damp earth. The smell came next. Rotten fruit mixed with wet dog and charred grease. A stench thick enough to taste. My stomach clenched. Probably a buck. I whispered, though I didn't believe it. Yeah, Em said. He didn't believe it either. I reached for Grandpa's old .22 leaning against the wall. My hand shook so hard the barrel clinked tin. Em flicked on our only decent flashlight and aimed the beam toward the sound. Between trunks the light cut white cones but illuminated nothing. Only more darkness. The crunching moved left around the cabin. Something circled. I pivoted, trying to track it. The smell moved with it. Then, without any warning, a rock the size of a bowling ball whistled from our right, missed Em by inches, and slammed to earth near the fire. Sparks geysered. The rock rolled and settled against my boot toe. Panic detonated inside my chest. Em jerked the flashlight beam across tree trunks. Manic. "Who's there?" he shouted. A pointless challenge. Whatever stalked us ignored him. My world narrowed to thumping heartbeats. The crunching stopped. Silence again. A tightness that pressed against eardrums. From beyond the wall, from the darkness that seemed to gaze back through gaps in corrugation, came 3 knocks. Knock, knock, knock. They were evenly spaced, deeper and more resonant than woodpecker strikes. They sounded like someone taking a baseball bat to an oak. "Pack now," Em whispered. I nodded because words froze. We rolled sleeping bags, stuffed them half-folded into Grandpa's doorway, kicked dirt on the fire, and slung our paintball markers. The .22 felt microscopic in my grip. Em swung the flashlight in circles. No eyes reflected. We stepped into the trail. Darkness consumed around us. The flashlight beam jittered with Em's shaking hand. Saplings on either side arched overhead like bars on a cage. My lungs burned, though I'd yet to run. A scream tore through the timber behind us. High, keening, but layered under with a guttural bellow, as if 2 throats cried at once. I flinched so hard the rifle barrel wobbled skyward. Something massive thrashed through brush, snapping branches like soda straws. Panic stole coordination. I stumbled, caught myself, hurdled a root knot, bolted, and ran beside me, breath hitching, switchbacks blurred. The smell, carrion sweet, canine dank, poured down the hill with us. Another rock hurtled from darkness, crashed through leaves, smacked ground to our right. We never saw it coming. We hit the lower yard, ragged grass patch beneath Grandma's old mercury light, and only then braked. My heart bucked, and bent double, palms on knees. We wanted to feel safe in that puddle of yellow light, yet both sensed the thing still watched. I had always trusted our woods. In daylight, the hills were playground. But suddenly I knew the mountain held secrets older than our family, older than our stories, and the secrets had teeth. I thought then of Uncle Joe, whose place at Grandma's brimmed with hunting rifles and who once said of black bears, "They don't want trouble. Shout loud and they vanish." I wanted to believe we'd enraged a bear, wanted to label the unknown so I could file it away and forget. But bears didn't throw rocks, and bears didn't knock 3 times from 3 sides. We sprinted the blacktop toward Grandma's. An asphalt quarter-mile never felt longer. When we crashed through her screen door, Aunt June almost dropped her casserole spoon. Uncle Joe stripped his sharpening steel mid-stroke. The television lights flickered across Cousin A's stunned face. Between gasps we metered fragments. Something up there, eyes in the dark, rocks flying. Uncle Joe squinted. "Probably a black bear," he said. "Bears don't stand 9 feet tall," Em managed. Uncle shrugged. Different people, different thresholds for the absurd. Dad arrived minutes later in his Silverado. We left the .22 leaning by Uncle Joe's easy chair, no rush to reclaim a toy weapon, and rode home. On the 2-lane, silence ruled. I pressed a palm to my chest. Each thud echoed the triple knock. Sleep evaded us both. Saturday the sky blazed white and made Fort Tin seem impossible. A dream birthed by kids who underestimated mountains. Only Sunday afternoon did Dad relent and agree to escort us up the ridge, more to hush our pleading than because he feared bogeymen. He strapped on his own .357 revolver, told us to carry only what we intended to haul down, and climbed. I watched his back, broad and solid, and wondered if evil cared how broad a man's shoulders were. We found sign everywhere. 50 yards uphill, 2 rocks, each 20 pounds at least, blocked the trail, their craggy undersides wet with fresh soil. Farther up, saplings leaned at insane angles, trunks snapped off wrist-thick. At Fort Tin, my bike's front will lay deep in pawpaw thicket, spokes tangled. The pallets of our half-pipe looked as if fists had punched through. 3 dents bowed the wall that faced the woods, each shaped like a scoop from a backhoe bucket. Lower still, on the aluminum back door, for vertical slashes cut through decades of weathered paint, claw marks curved like scimitars. Dad studied the gouges, glanced downhill at the snapped saplings, but never offered an explanation. We packed. He walked a few paces ahead as we descended, hand always hovering near the pistol grip. Never returned to Fort Tin. The shell still stands, though now my children call it Grampy's Shed. I built my own house in Grandma's old yard, poured new concrete where her single wide rested. At dusk I bring the kids inside before the mercury light flickers on. My wife thinks I worry too much about bobcats and coyotes unafraid of children. She has never smelled carrion dog rot on the wind, never heard the forest silence itself in midsong. Some nights, when wind slides over the ridge just right, I still hear distant knocks. 3 slow strikes that hum through oak and hickory like plucked cello strings. Now that I am grown, I tell myself it is oak beaks hammering trees, or maybe wooden limbs rubbing in the wind. But memory lives deeper than logic. Sometimes when I pass the tin wall, a chill settles inside me, and all the grown-up comforts, deadbolts, floodlights, firearms, cannot thaw it. To outsiders, Broad Hill is just another knob among thousands that crease southeastern Kentucky. To me, it is the place where childhood ended with a scream in the dark. Perhaps one day I will take my son up there and show him the dented wall and the old half-pipe frame. Perhaps I will rake my finger across the 4 rising claw tracks and hand him a story about black bears, same as Uncle Joe handed one to me. Or perhaps I will keep the truth folded away because it is too heavy to hand a child. I still don't know which is kinder. What I do know is this. Somewhere above the tin shack, tucked among sandstone boulders and pine shadow, something walks that is neither beast nor man. Something that listens to cicadas hush and owls choke off mid-call. Something that bangs out warnings with knuckles made of stone and, when warnings fail, flings granite through darkness as casually as a boy flicking marbles. Cannot name it. Cannot prove it. All I can do is remember, and lock the back door when the whip-pour will stop singing. I guess every place has its story. City kids talk about ghosts in abandoned factories. Desert folks whisper of lights that dance over empty mesas. Here in the Green Hills we tell the story of the hollow knock, of the ridge where the night creatures silence themselves, of rocks that fly against firelight. We tell it in low voices around church picnic tables and on deer stands before dawn. Shrug afterward like it's nothing. Like we don't sometimes lie awake waiting for branches to crack outside the bedroom window. The night of the knock happened when I was 14. I am 32 now. Has kids of his own in Ohio. He says he never once took them camping. Dad still mows hay in the bottoms, slower now. Grandpa's tin house still stands. It has new dents these days. Hailstones, maybe, or the playful battering of black bears that Uncle Joe always insisted roam our hills. I've never gone up after dark to check. I don't plan to. I was born into a family where the extraordinary was treated like an ordinary part of life, an inheritance passed down through generations. On my mother's side, the roots dig deep into English soil. There was a great aunt everyone spoke of in hushed tones. A black witch, a necromancer, a woman who preferred the company of graveyards to tea parlors. Around her hovered a constellation of Wiccans, distant cousins, aunts, uncles, each with a slightly different understanding of herbs, incantations, full moon rituals, and the way energies slide through the human spirit. On my father's side, Cherokee blood ran true. There were long-gone medicine men and shamans whose names survived in family stories. the kind of names that make grown adults lower their voices, insisting they felt those ancestors watching from the other side of a campfire. All of that heritage rolled together and landed in me. Since childhood I could see, hear, and occasionally speak to spirits. I did not exactly choose the gift. The gift simply opened its eyes inside me. My strange lineage usually made the world more colorful than frightening. I learned practical boundaries, how to smudge a room with sage, how to close a vision when it became too loud. Yet nothing in my upbringing prepared me for the thing I met on a lonely Washington bridge in late 2019. The encounter forced me to question whether there are corners of the occult even my family's stories never mapped. And it taught me that, no matter how experienced you think you are, terror has a way of prying your jaw open and pouring itself down your throat. I was 23 and living in a small town tucked along forested foothills near Mount St. Helens. People there tell Bigfoot jokes the way city folk complain about traffic, reflexively as part of life. I had recently taken up night driving through the woods as a way to bleed off the stress that clung to me after a long shift. The rhythm was simple. Clock out, change into comfortable clothes, load a pistol into the side door panel, a habit born of my work and my family's caution. Then let the car glide along logging roads until the engine and the evergreen silence blurred into a single note. Sometimes I would kill the headlights and coast beneath moonlight. Sometimes I would pull over and step outside just to hear how deep the dark could hum. That Friday evening had been rough. Customers were cranky, my feet ached, and rain had poured on and off all afternoon. By the time I drove beyond the last street lamp, the sky was clear but moonless, and the pavement was drying in cold silver patches. I carried a 15-round magazine of hollow points, plus one in the chamber, and an LED flashlight I trusted with my life. A streamlight, bright as lightning, tough enough to shatter glass, small enough to slide into my pocket without snagging. Some people relax with a six-pack. I relaxed with a gun, a torch, and the sound of pine boughs slapping the roof as I eased under them. I followed a winding forest highway until it crossed into National Forest territory. Once the asphalt's painted lines disappeared, I slowed. A few miles later, the road narrowed to a single lane. That's where I spotted a sedan pulled onto the shoulder, hazard lights blinking like orange fireflies. Experience had taught me two rules. Never ignore someone who might need help, and never trust the scenario until you confirm what's real. So I rolled past, scanning. One man, alone, leaning over his flat tire with a tiny wrench. No second figure crouching behind the trunk. No glint of a concealed weapon in his waistband. He looked tired and frustrated. I backed up, stepped out, and offered assistance. He lacked reception to call a tow. My phone had a single bar farther uphill, so we drove to that spot, rang roadside services, and within 15 minutes it was settled. He thanked me profusely. I shrugged it off. Good deed done. And because I still had hours before dawn, I turned the car around, aiming deeper into the trees. I had barely gone a mile when a bridge appeared, one I'd crossed a dozen times in daylight and perhaps 5 times after dark. Concrete guardrails, chain-link fence bolted to short iron posts, a steep ravine yawning beneath. Tonight something looked wrong. Halfway across I noticed a new hole torn through the fencing, a ragged circle big enough for a grown man to crawl through. Slivers of metal curled outward as though pried by monstrous fingers. Curiosity overwhelmed caution. I braked, stepped out, and let the door click shut behind me. Overhead, stars were hidden by clouds, so the world felt boxed in, a corridor of faint silver gloom. My boots scuffed across the concrete. A strange noise rose, a faint metallic screech accompanied by intermittent grinding, like heavy iron dragged across stone. It vibrated up through the soles of my shoes into my shins. The bridge actually shivered under the strain, as if something monstrous pressed against its bones. I switched on the flashlight. Its beam gouged into the night, revealing the ruptured chain link. In the ravine far below, I saw a flash of orange reflective plastic, a road construction barrel lying on its side, perfectly centered in the creek. A traffic cone that size would have weighed more than 50 pounds. No maintenance crew would drop it here intentionally. How did it end up down there? While my mind chewed the mystery, the grinding stopped. Silence swallowed the air. Then from beneath the bridge emerged a hand. Pale white, enormous, fingertips ending in claws razor-thin and curved. It slapped onto the ledge only a foot from my right boot. A second hand followed, gripping the concrete lip. My breath caught in my throat. I watched, transfixed by a horror I did not fully register as real until the figure hauled itself upward, exposing a head. The creature's skull looked stretched, elongated, tapering toward a pointed chin. Its flesh was corpse-pale, almost luminous in the beam. Eye sockets plunged deep into the bone, housing black pits that reflected nothing. Where a human mouth would open wide, this thing's jaws formed a narrow slit. When it hissed, the slit widened enough to reveal needle teeth, and a gagging stench rushed out like spoiled meat left too long in heat. I'd faced apparitions, glimpsed ancestors, felt the cold finger of a spirit brush my cheek, but never had anything corporeal threatened my life. Instinct surged. Without thinking, I stowed the flashlight and drew my pistol in a single practiced motion. The weapon light snapped on, stabbing the night with harsh white. The creature still clung to the ledge, claws scraping concrete. I fired. Recoil punched my wrists. Shell casings flipped and danced across the bridge. The report echoed off distant trunks. The thing did not howl, kept climbing. I adjusted aim, dumped the rest of the magazine center mass, reloaded, and continued firing. Bang, bang, bang. Slide lock. Finger to mag release. Fresh metal slammed home. Rack slide. Bang, bang. Between each strobe of muzzle flash I registered more of its body. Tall, gaunt, legs jointed wrong, the ribs too long under parchment skin. It gained the walkway, standing perhaps 11 feet when fully upright. I stumbled backward. There were 12 feet between me and the car. My second magazine emptied. The monster staggered once, as if annoyed. Smoke and gun smell curled around my face. Sweat stung my eyes. Fight gave way to flight. I turned and sprinted. Somewhere between the thud of boots and the slam of my door I swapped magazines again, chambered around and gunned the engine. As the headlights swung across the bridge rail, I glimpsed the creature retreating, slipping back through the same hole like a spider retreating into a drain. Then the darkness swallowed it. I drove. Trees blurred. The rearview mirror showed nothing but dust. Roughly 20 songs later, somewhere around 6 minutes of music, I rolled into town, parked outside my apartment, unlocked a larger firearm from a safe, and texted my friend Bill. He answered in 5 words, "Be right there. Bring ammo." 15 minutes later, we were heading back into the forest. I described everything. Bill, who had always been open-minded about the supernatural but never experienced more than creaky attic noises, listened wide-eyed. He gripped a 12-gauge like it was the last branch above a flood. When we reached the bridge again, only spent casings testified something had occurred. Blood, if any, was gone. The hole remained, but the night was quiet, brooding. We flashed beams under the span. The orange barrel still lay in the creek, faintly visible. Bill kept the shotgun trained. I watched the tree lean for movement. Nothing emerged. An hour passed. Eventually we left, shaken and unsatisfied. 5 months drifted by. Winter relinquished her grip and early spring thawed the lower slopes of Mount St. Helens. I met Nicole. She was sharp-witted, curious, and openly sensitive to energies. The kind of person who walks into a room and immediately knows who argued there 15 minutes earlier. Our third date was a starlit drive through the same network of forest roads. By then I had researched skinwalker legends and learned the area was heavy with native stories about creatures that stole forms, clawed through realities, and hunted along lonely tracks. I kept the details to myself. I didn't want to scare her. One evening Nicole, Bill, and I piled into my car. I found myself retelling the bridge incident in a half-humorous tone, softening the monstrous description to keep conversation light. Nicole listened more intently than I expected. As we rolled deeper among moss-coated trunks, her natural glow dimmed. She grew quiet, unclipped her seatbelt to wedge herself forward between the seats, and stared out the windshield at the shadows ahead. 10 miles from the bridge, she started shivering though the heater was running. At 5 miles her lips were pale, She wrapped her arms around her torso and said she felt watched, as if fingers trailed along her spine. Bill placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. He glanced at me, silent question in his eyes. Was she picking up what you faced? No worries, I muttered, more to myself than anyone. Melissa Creek Bridge, that was its county map name, appeared at the bend like a gray ribbon between walls of cedar. Nicole's breath hitched. We rolled onto the span. Her shaking intensified until I thought her teeth would crack. She had no way of knowing this was the exact bridge. I'd never described its location. Yet her reaction left no doubt. Then we spotted something new. Fresh flowers woven through the torn fencing, bright heads bobbing in the breeze. Daffodils, daisies, wild lupin. 20 or 30 stems threaded carefully through links to form a wreath around the jagged hole. Bill swore softly. Nicole closed her eyes, whispering a word I didn't catch. Parked. The engine ticked. No sound of birds. The forest hush felt heavy, like a lid on a pot. Nicole's head bowed. Someone died here, she said. Her eyes brimmed with tears. They were taken. The barrel flashed in my memory. Maybe it marked where a body was found. I voiced the theory aloud. As the concept hung between us, the car filled with a sudden wave of sorrow, palpable, pressing on the heart. It lasted seconds. Then another swell hit, hot and savage. A rage so pure it vibrated the steering column. The windows fogged. All three of us gasped. I have felt anger, from enemies, from spirits, from my own chest, but never such concentrated, carnivorous wrath. Clawed at the mind, urging violence, urging blood. Bill racked the shotgun instinctively. Nicole squeezed her eyes shut, lips skimming silent prayer. I gripped the wheel until my knuckles bleached. The rage pulsed, then ebbed, leaving behind a taste like copper. We drove. Branches flashed past. No one spoke until highway lights reappeared. After dropping Bill at his apartment, Nicole and I drove south toward Portland. She said the presence clung to her like a thorn in flesh. For months afterward, she experienced nightmares. Tall white forms pulling her through holes in reality, claws scoring bridges, flowers wilting under unseen shadows. We burned sage. We prayed. The nightmares faded gradually. From then on, I avoided Melissa Creek Bridge. Night driving lost its carefree glow. Instead, I sat on my porch, journal in hand, trying to sketch the thing's face, though face is a poor term for that skull. Each attempt ended with charcoal smear and a feeling that some images, once captured, might start breathing on paper. What was it? A skinwalker torn far from its ancestral lands? A manifestation older than tribal memory? An echo of the mountain's own buried fire? Theories swirl, but answers retreat. I do know this. The supernatural lineage I inherited taught me that the veil is thin and porous. Spirits commune, guides appear, ancestors whisper. Yet there are things in the dark older than compassion, and not every shadow respects prayer or pistol fire. Still, that night proved that courage is not measured by whether you feel fear but by whether you act despite it. Part of me wishes I could dismiss the encounter as hallucination, blame adrenaline or drink or fatigue. But bullet casings glinting on concrete say otherwise. Flowers woven around a wound in chain link say otherwise. And a woman who trembled before she even knew the location, that says otherwise too. I share this story not to boast, not to terrify, but to warn. If ever you find yourself alone on a forest bridge and sense a grinding beneath your feet, do not lean into the hole. Whatever climbs the girders may not be legend. It may not be shy. And if you must face it, remember that empty darkness can be driven back by a single point of light, whether the stark blade of a streamlight beam or the quieter glow that ignites when three frightened humans stand together, refusing the devouring night. We have not returned. The forest feels different now, heavy, watchful. Yet I still carry an ember of wonder. Because if monstrosities lurk between cedar trunks, so too might guardians, unseen but listening. I do not know whether the spirit of a medicine man shielded us, or whether my gray tant's secrets crackled through my blood, or whether a prayer uttered beneath my breath reached an ear I cannot name. I only know that terror did not win. And even in a world where fences rip open like tissue and pale claws scrape asphalt, that is something worth carrying home. I will tell the whole story again, but this time I will open every door, walk every path, and slow down long enough to show you exactly how one summer week on our West Texas ranch turned into a nightmare. I will not leave out the small details. The crack of dry cedar under my boot, the dead heat that sticks to a man's skin even after sundown, the lonely bark of the neighbor's dog across the highway 2 miles off. I want you to feel the hush that fell on our land and understand how a proud, ordinary ranch boy reached the moment where he lifted his father's .30-30 and emptied every round he owned into a thing that should not exist. In the end, the story is not only about fear, but about duty and stubborn roots that tie a person to his home like barbed wire. I will write it plainly, with no fancy tricks, because the truth does not need decoration. If my words run long, that is all right. Some stories refuse to fit in a short frame, and this is one of them. My name is Luke McCann, and I turned 17 on the 1st of June. Our ranch sits at the edge of the Caprock, half grass, half mesquite scrub, 522 acres that belong to my family because my great-grandfather homesteaded the water rights back when the county still printed the deeds by hand. My father, Dale, runs a mixed operation. About 300 head of beef cattle in rotation, plus 16 quarter horses, a couple of mules, half a dozen barn cats, and 2 old blue heelers who have long since retired from real cowdog work. The land rises gentle from the state highway to the north fence, then drops in a tangle of cedar breaks and washouts we always call the woods, even though true Texans know our trees are nothing like the tall pines of East Texas or the hardwood thickets of the eastern states. Out here, a cedar that reaches 20 feet is a monarch. The ground is red as rust and smells of salt and iron when the rain comes, which is not often enough. Mom and Dad married straight out of high school, built their house, 1-story, blonde brick metal roof, on a caliche pad at the south rim of the property, and raised 3 kids under the wide sky. My brother Wyatt is 10 years older than I am. He rodeoed all through college, then took a job on a feedlot outside Amarillo. My sister Camille is 6 years older. She earned a nursing degree, moved to Colorado, and met a wildlife biologist. They now live in Fort Collins. That leaves me youngest and last, the one who never missed a dawn feeding and never asked to spend spring break anywhere but the branding pen. I love this place the way some boys love muscle cars or Friday night lights. The land is a living thing, stubborn as an old bull, and when you care for it right, you feel its heart beating under your boots. The summer my parents planned a trip to France. The idea surprised the whole county. Folks around here seldom cross the state line, let alone the ocean. Mom teaches art at the elementary school, and she studied French painters in college. She kept a postcard of Monet's Lily Pond taped to the refrigerator. Dad pretended he could not care less about foreign gardens, but I saw him thumbing through the travel book, tracing the map of Normandy beaches where his own father landed during World War II. After many evenings of debate, they booked flights, hotels, and a rental car. They would be gone 7 nights. During those nights, I would be the only McCann sleeping under the ranch roof. Dad sat me down at the kitchen table 2 weeks before departure. He slid a yellow legal pad in front of me, lines filled with his neat block letters. The first page listed every daily chore. The second listed weekly duties. The third listed rifle calibers, safe combinations, phone numbers for neighbors, the vet, and the sheriff's dispatch. Dad is not a talkative man, but he spoke for an hour, explaining why the south barn latch sometimes pops open in rain, why the water trough at the west quarter refills slow, why a heifer in pen 7 will freshen soon so I must watch her bag. When he finished, he took a long breath, clapped my shoulder, and said only, "You've got it." I nodded, both proud and nervous. Mom hugged me and reminded me to eat vegetables, which made Dad grin because ranch suppers lean heavy on chicken fried steak and potatoes. Wyatt called that night, said he would drive down if I needed backup. I laughed and told him I was practically grown. Camille sent a text drowning in exclamation marks. "So proud of you, little bro." The next morning I woke before sunrise, saddled Shiloh, and trotted along the east fence, telling myself I was already the man of the place. Monday and Tuesday ran smooth. I rose at 5, poured coffee black, walked out to the feed room, and inhaled the sweet grain smell that never fails to wake a man better than caffeine. Shiloh nickered a greeting. The cattle bunched along the rail fence, heads low, steam curling from their nostrils. By noon the sun burned white, heat shimmered dancing above the short grass, the kind of day where sweat dries before it drips. I changed sprinkler gaskets, scraped mud from the tractor scoop, and scrolled through Ada's messages. "You eating lunch? Don't melt out there. I'm bringing pie after work." Smiley face. Ada and I had dated nearly a year. She was no ranch hand, yet she wore boots without complaining. Tuesday afternoon she drove up in her dusty Dodge, braid over one shoulder, cherry pie still warm. We sat on the porch swing, fan blades clicking overhead, boots crossed, talking about senior year and how she might join track though she hated running. Later we walked the fence, me pointing out antelope sign, she teasing me about my lecture voice. When she left, sky already violet, I locked the gates, sprayed the horse trough for mosquitoes, and sat guard with the .30-30 across my knees, a habit Dad drilled into us during calving seasons when coyotes yipped too close. That night nothing stirred except a faraway freight train and the sleepy chirp of a single cricket. Wednesday evening things changed. The air felt odd thick, hushed, as if the land held its breath. I sat on the porch, boots on rail, rifle resting, when the hair prickled on my arms. I scanned the treeline. That was when I saw it. A figure thin as a fence picket, blacker than shadow, standing half behind a cedar about 30 yards off. I could not see features, only the outline, but it was clearly upright, shoulders sloped, one arm visible. I called out, calm but firm, the way Dad taught me to address trespassers. "Evenin'. This is private land. Move on." No answer. No shift. Even the leaves seemed unnaturally still. I lifted the rifle, finger alongside the guard, not on the trigger, and repeated the warning. I blinked once, the way a person blinks to clear dust, and the figure vanished. Not step back, gone. I held my pose another minute, searching. Nothing. Finally I lowered the gun, clicked the safety, and told myself the eyes play tricks at twilight. By 11:30 I still lay awake, unease knotting my stomach. I swung boots off the bed, loaded a full magazine, and walked the porch again. Stars glittered cruel bright. Moon had not yet risen. A warm wind carried the faint scent of cattle. I turned off my phone music to listen. The ranch felt hollow. No coyotes howled. No insects rasped. I almost went back inside. Then the barn erupted, cows bawling, wood cracking, metal banging. I sprinted, rifle bouncing. The south door hung skewed on one hinge. I shoved inside, flashlight swinging. Calves tumbled over each other. Dust swirled. The far stall gate sagged open, and there lay a heifer, throat to belly ripped wide, entrails steaming. The smell hit me like a hammer. Copper blood and something older. Rotten. I'd gutted deer, so I did not vomit, but my hands trembled. I swept the beam across rafters, no predator in sight. The kill looked recent, yet whatever did it was gone. Bobcats rarely tackle grown cattle, and coyotes tear in packs, not single slashes. Mountain lions wander the caprock sometimes, but they bite the neck and drag prey to cover. Dad's herd had never lost a cow this way. I cursed softly, pulled the heifer clear with chains and the tractor, buried her beyond the pens, then faced a choice. Call Dad in France? No. He couldn't help and would only worry Mom. Call the sheriff? Evidence too weird. So I decided, find the killer myself. At dawn I fetched the heifer's hide from the grave, still slick, tied it to the buggy hitch, and drove deep into the cedar breaks, farther than usual, until a low clearing opened beside an old arroyo. I chained the hide to a stump, mounted a trail camera high, and paired it with my phone app. As I worked, every snap of twig sounded like footsteps. My breath felt loud. Finished, climbed in, and bumped home. I tried to distract myself with chores, but my gaze kept darting to the phone. Mid-afternoon, sweat dripping, I stepped into the shade to check the camera feed. The first frame showed nothing. The second, something blurred at edge. I enlarged. A hand? But spindly, elongated, skin pale gray? My pulse thudded. The third frame held the creature full. It squatted over the hide, clawed fingers sunk into flesh. Its torso resembled a starved man's, rib bones stark, skin parchment taut, legs reversed like a deer's hindquarters, ending in hooves. From its spine sprouted short antler nubs. But the head, an entire deer skull, antlers thick, empty eye holes. Yet in the photo, inside each socket glowed 2 coals, as though life burned behind bone. I slammed the phone dark, heart hammering. In hunting magazines I had read folk tales of wendigos, spirits born of winter hunger, doomed to devour forever. Some articles joked they were cryptids. Others warned they craved human flesh. I never believed any of it. Now I stared at proof on my phone gallery. My thumb hovered above the delete icon. Instead, I tucked the phone in my pocket, marched to the gun safe, and cleaned the .30-30 until the action glided like water. I packed every 170 grain round I owned, 60 in total, in a belt and bag. I strapped on a flashlight, hunting knife, canteen. At the door I paused, breathing fast, then whispered a prayer Dad once taught us. Lord, guide my sight, stead my hand, guard my soul. Sun was lowering. I had maybe 2 hours of light. The woods greeted me with silence. I walked the same path by rote, but each cedar seemed to lean closer, each shadow thicker. Flies usually buzzed near the arroyo. None did now. Halfway there, bird chatter quit cold. A hush rolled over like a heavy blanket. I stopped. Air smelled wrong. Sweet rot, like a dead cow left too long. Then a voice called behind me. It held my mother's exact tone. Luke, supper's hot. But syllables stretched, warped. Mom was across the Atlantic. The rifle swung of its own accord as I spun. Safety snapped off. Nothing but dusk. My pulse pounded behind my eyes. Another voice, this time my father's baritone, from the opposite direction. Son, come here. Same stretched timbre. I swallowed hard, forced boots forward. The stink grew thicker. At last I reached the clearing. Blood darkened the hide, but the wendigo was gone. Footprints, hooves sinking deep, circled, then vanished toward the thicker cedar. I paced 3 steps when branches cracked behind me. I whirled. The creature rose from behind a trunk. It must have followed me, stalking like a cat. Standing, it measured over 8 feet. Limbs dangled like dry branches. It tilted the skull and inhaled, the hiss scraping my nerves raw. I raised the rifle. Before I could fire, the wendigo spoke in a rasp layered with many voices. My own, Dad's, Ada's. Run, boy! The command vibrated inside my chest. I pulled the trigger. Flame leapt. The bullet smacked flesh. The creature jerked but did not fall. I cycled the lever, fired twice more. Each impact punched darkness into its torso. Thick black sludge dripped. It screamed, high, furious, like wind through dead oaks. Charged. I backpedaled, firing barrel hot. One hoof lashed, glancing my shoulder and spinning me into scrub. Pain lanced down my arm. I scrambled upright just as its claws slashed air where my head had been. I jammed the barrel against its chest and fired point blank. Bones cracked. The thing staggered, wheezed, then turned, lurching into the trees, bleeding tar. Branches snapped farther, farther, until silence returned. I stood shaking, rifle empty. Cartridge cases littered the dirt. My shoulder throbbed, shirt sleeve ripped, blood trickling. Adrenaline kept me upright. I reloaded by feel, tremoring fingers sliding brass into the tube. Dusk bled into night. Stars blinked on. The hush lifted. Cicadas chirred. An owl hooted. Wind rustled leaves. The woods again sounded alive. I half laughed, half sobbed, then hobbled home by moonlight. At the porch I slumped against a post, checked my wound, just a gash, not deep. I stripped the torn fabric, cleaned with whiskey, wrapped a bandage. Inside, I poured myself water, gulped, then copied the trail cam pictures to a thumb drive and hid it in my desk. I tried to sleep, but every creak set my nerves blazing. Sunrise found me pacing. Mom and Dad landed that afternoon. They video called from Paris airport, bright-eyed. I lied, said all was fine. I could not spoil their trip with talk of monsters. Instead, I cleaned the rifle again, hung motion lights on fence posts, added 2 new locks to barn doors. The next evening Ada arrived with worry in her eyes, noticing the bandage. I fed her a story about twisting my arm fixing a hinge. She studied me but did not pry. Days turned into weeks. The Wendigo did not return. Trail cameras caught only raccoons and nightskis. Yet sometimes, deep before dawn, the dogs, who seldom bark, rose in their pens and growled at the woods. Sometimes cicadas fell silent all at once while I mucked stalls, and the hairs on my neck lifted. Each time I froze, listening. No antlered skull emerged. When my parents finally drove home, I met them at the gate. Dad frowned at the new locks but said nothing until quiet supper ended. Mom busy unpacking souvenirs. Then he nodded toward the porch. Outside, I handed him the thumb drive. He plugged it into his laptop under the porch light, scrolled through frames, stopping at the one where the beast peered into the camera. He exhaled through his nose, slow. With 2 fingers he erased the file, then took the drive apart and crushed the chip under his boot. "Some things," he said, "you don't let keep living in pictures." He looked at me, eyes proud, weary. "You kept this place safe. That's enough." We burned the heifer's hide, ashes scattering on red dirt. He taught me an old Comanche verse his grandfather had passed down. Words meant to cleanse ground of bad spirits. We spoke the verse, poured salt at each gate. Mom noticed none of it. Dad told her coyotes had bothered a calf, nothing more. So life resumed. Cattle still needed feeding, fences mending. I still rode Shiloh at sunrise, dust cold on my cheeks. Ada and I still walked the rows of mesquite blooms. Yet certain sounds now put me on edge. A sudden silence in the trees. A smell of decay that passes on the breeze though no dead animal lies nearby. When that happens, I pause, thumb brushing the cartridges at my belt, and remind myself of the promise I made to this land. I will guard it. My blood runs here like roots, and no hunger born of nightmare will force me to leave. The Wendigo may have fled, wounded, back to whatever hollow fuels its starvation. Maybe my bullets will not kill such a thing, but pain drove it off. Dad says evil sometimes probes the edges of a place, looking for weakness, and a man's courage can be a fence as strong as wire and cedar posts. I do not know. I only know I have not heard my mother's voice in the woods again, nor my own voice echoing from among the trees. And so each night, before I turn out the porch light, I step onto the boards, grip the rail, and stare toward the tree-line where a shadow once stood. The land meets my gaze in silence, holding its breath, and then lets it out, wind rushing softly through cedar needles. I answer with a nod, go inside, and lay Dad's rifle within reach. If ever that hush falls hard again, and the woods speak with stolen voices, I will be ready, because a rancher's first job is to protect the living things that depend on him. Cattle, horses, family, and sometimes that means standing between them and the dark, even when the dark wears antlers and a skull for a face. Maybe that is foolish, maybe brave. On our West Texas land, it is simply what a man does. I was born on 522 acres of scrub and rolling grass that my family has called home since the winter of 1911. The McPherson Ranch sits on the eastern lip of the West Texas Caprock, a place where the soil turns from rust-red clay to blinding white caliche, where mesquite twists in the wind like arthritic fingers and every live oak seems to carry a century of dust on its leathery leaves. If you have never felt that land under your boots, you have never felt anything quite like it. The raw bite of the sun at midsummer, the smell of rain 50 miles away coming in on a black wall of cloud, the sound of coyotes harmonizing with a freight train as it rattles across the horizon at 3 in the morning. Most strangers who pass through think it's empty country, but anyone raised their nose the land breathes and broods. It remembers every hoof that ever cut into its crust, every shovel that turned its dirt, every man who swore to tame it and died before he finished the job. I was 17 when my parents decided they needed to travel, all the way to France, of all places. Nobody in our family had crossed the Atlantic since my great-grandfather shipped out to the trenches in 1918. But Mom had spent 26 years looking after livestock, kids, bookkeeping, and church suppers, and Dad finally admitted she deserved a vacation. They planned to be gone just 7 nights, long enough to visit Monet's lily ponds at Giverny, long enough to stand on the Normandy bluffs where my great-granddad scrambled under machine gun fire, and maybe long enough, Dad joked, so they could recall why they married in the first place. In a family that measures time by calving seasons and harvests, 7 nights is nothing. Unless you spend those nights alone, listening to the house creak in the heat and wondering what moves in the cedar breaks beyond the yard light. My brother, Colton, is 10 years older than I am, and he'd already hired on at a feedlot 3 counties north. My sister, June, 6 years older, had run off to Colorado with a ski patrol foreman. That left me. Dad sat me at the kitchen table 2 weeks before their flight, placed a yellow legal pad in front of me, and tapped each page. Page 1. Daily chores: feed, water, check fences, check the mare that liked to colic whenever the barometer dipped, test the well pump at the south line. Page 2. Emergency numbers: Doc Romero, who would gladly drive 30 miles at midnight to pull a breech calf. Sheriff Strickland, who had a habit of leaving his cruiser running while he gossiped on the porch. Louisa, the dispatcher, who once talked me through stitching a yearling open with barbed wire. Page 3. Firearm inventory. My father never wrote anything without purpose, so when he copied serial numbers, caliber, recommended load, and safe combination, I understood that the rifles were more than decoration. He laid down the pencil, folded his hands, and studied me like he had studied every yearling I ever brought to him for judgment. "Boy," he said, "I trust you, but trust is earned every dawn and proved every dusk. Keep the place tight. Nothing leaves the ranch without your say-so." I nodded. That was how I became the McPherson foreman, at least for a week. Mom hugged me in the driveway an hour before sunrise on departure day. "Eat something green once in a while, please," she whispered. "And don't let your father's worries fill up your head." Dad shook my hand. A handshake may sound ordinary, but a ranch boy knows when his father curls those calloused fingers around his own and squeezes just enough to say, "You are my right hand." That handshake is a contract. They drove away in a swirl of caliche dust. Monday morning cracked open blue and gold. I saddled Shiner, our calmest quarter horse gelding, and trotted north to the far fence where a cottonwood limb had dropped in last week's wind. By midday I'd cleared brush from 3/4-mile swaths and repaired a windmill gearbox that whined like a coyote with its paw caught. The day's routine settled on me, the way the smell of molasses grain settles in a feed room. Familiar, satisfying. After sunset, I sat on the porch swing with the .30-30 across my thighs and listened to the coyotes sing and the barn owls trade shrill jokes. I went to bed thinking nothing in the world could sneak up on a man who knew his own land the way I did. Tuesday, Ada drove over. We'd been dating almost a year, long enough that she could find the ranch road without asking directions twice. She left her Dodge near the gate and clomped across the yard in dusty turquoise boots, braid over her shoulder, a cherry pie still warm in her hands. She laughed at my new title, acting foreman, and I showed her the award Mom had taped to the fridge, a sticky note that said, "Don't break anything." Ada and I ate pie on the porch, boots hooked on opposite rails, teasing each other about who'd win the final barrel racing event at the county fair. By twilight, she drove home in a blaze of lingering daylight, headlights guiding her down the rutted track. I locked the gates, checked the stanchions, and slept dreamless. Wednesday is when the heartbeat of the ranch faltered. Mid-afternoon, I noticed the wind had dropped out of the sky. Usually a breeze runs steady off the caprock, rattling the mesquite leaves. This was a dead calm, the sort that makes sweat bead under your collar even in the shade. The dogs, Blue and Molly, normally bark at jackrabbits around this hour. They lay on the porch, heads up, silent. I poured grain, filled troughs, ticked every chore off the yellow pad, but the stillness followed me like a second shadow. Dusk arrived like someone dimmed the horizon's lamp. I settled on the porch rocker, rifle propped, phone speaker playing Old Merle Haggard low. That was when I caught movement at the edge of my vision. A shape partway behind a cedar trunk, tall, lean, pitch black. 30 yards away. Arms, yes, and shoulders, but too long, narrow. My skin prickled. I called, steady voice. "Private land out here. If you're lost, speak up." Nothing. Even the crickets shut their mouths. I raised the rifle, finger clear of the trigger, and repeated. Blinked. Shadow gone. Leaves never rustled. I stayed outside until midnight, scanning, barrel across my knees, but the clearing remained empty. I might have dismissed it, chalked it to tired eyes, if not for what happened hours later. At 2:14 a.m., I remember because my phone screen glowed that time as I checked. I heard a crash from the barn. Cattle lowed in alarm, hoofbeats on planks. I grabbed the rifle, sprinted. The south sliding door lay twisted, ripped from its runner. Inside, cows shoved each other against fences. A heifer lay near the rear stall, throat and chest carved open. The white rib bones glistened. Blood slicked the floorboards. No intruder in sight. I swept corners, loft, behind the hay bales. Nothing. The kill was fresh, steam still curled up. Mountain lion? Maybe, but lions leap for the neck and suffocate prey first. These lacerations looked slashing, tearing, as if carved by knives or claws longer than any cat I'd seen. I chained the door, dragged the carcass out with the tractor, buried her 300 yards behind an old windbreak. While shoveling, I thought of telling the sheriff, then pictured him shaking his head, blaming coyotes. Dad was overseas. Wyatt was hours away. June had newborn twins, no sense bothering her. So I made a decision. I would track whatever did this. Next dawn I hauled the heifer's hide, still reeking, to the deepest cedar tangle, a place we seldom entered because the gullies twist like mazes. I chained the hide to a stump, set a trail camera 15 feet away, high-angle camouflaged lens, linked the camera to my phone app. Sweat burned my split lip where a branch had whipped me earlier. Flies buzzed at the hide, but the stench kept me focused. I whispered a promise to the dead heifer, that I'd make the thing that killed her regret it, and headed out. I barely finished lunch when the phone hummed. Motion detected. First frame, the hide was alone. Second frame, blurred shape. I zoomed. The blur looked like a hand. Elongated fingers, skin mottled gray. Third frame stopped my breath. A creature crouched, ripping flesh. It resembled a starving man fused with a stag. Rib bones jutting, spine ridged, arms too long ending in claws, legs bent backward and shod in pointed hooves. Its head was a full deer skull, antlers branching like burnt timber, sockets aglow with ember red. The mouth? A maw inside bone stretching past human capacity. I saved the images, heart jackhammering. I thought of legends the Comanche crooned in winter camps. Cannibal spirits walking in hides of horn and bone. Wendigo, they whispered, never say the name after dark. This was Texas, far from Great Lakes forests where those tales were born. Yet my camera did not lie. My finger hovered over delete. Instead, I closed the phone, opened Dad's gun safe, and selected the same .30-30 but added 2 10-round bandoliers and a 6-inch Bowie knife for good measure. Grabbed a flashlight, canteen, and the ranch radio. At the doorway I paused, heart punching my sternum, and recited the prayer Granddad taught. Though I walk through the valley, I shall fear none. Then I walked toward the cedar break. The woods were wrong. Cicadas fell silent one by one until only my boot crunch sounded. Halfway in, breeze died. I smelled decay plus wet dog musk, plus something chemical like batteries leaking acid. The weight of that stench pressed against my chest. I forced myself onward. The clearing appeared ahead, hide dark on the stump. A ring of flies circled then darted away, as if something bigger disturbed them. I sensed movement behind and pivoted. Nothing. Pivoted again, still nothing. Yet the dread deepened, like standing on rotten planks over a pit. I reached the stump. The hide hung shredded, half-eaten, black goo smeared across the stump top. Footprints, irregular hooves, sank 2 inches into the damp clay. I knelt, touched one print. Still warm. A breeze rattled leaves. Wait, that was not wind. It was breathing. Hot, wet breath on my neck. I spun, rifle leveled. The Wendigo loomed 2 strides away, chest heaving, skull antlers scraping cedar fronds. Up close the bones were etched with dark runes, maybe natural fissures, maybe symbols. The black gums glistened around broken human-like teeth. It inhaled and a rattling moan seeped from its throat. Then, in my own father's baritone, it said, "Luke." My knees quivered. I fired. The slug smacked center mass, splattering viscous tar. The creature stumbled, glanced down, then roared in overlapping voices. Dad, Mom, Ada, even my own voice, stacked in a cacophony. Charged. I fired again. Missed. It swung a forelimb. Claws tore my shirt and peeled skin on my shoulder. I tumbled beside a cedar trunk. Pain flared. I scrambled, levered another round, and shot into its abdomen. Staggered. I rose, firing deliberate center-of-mass shots. 6, 7, 8. With each impact, the tar boiled, sizzling on the ground. The Wendigo shrieked, voice cracking into oppressive silence, then turned and bolted, crashing through brush toward the ravine. I swayed. My shoulder bled. I pressed a kerchief to the slice and backed out of the woods. Rifle leveled, adrenaline keeping my legs stiff. Reached the open pasture, half expected to see the thing bounding after me, but nothing emerged. I limped to the barn, washing the cut with hose water that stung like fire, then whiskey from Dad's cabinet to sterilize. Wrapped gauze, teeth gritted. In the house, I found half-frozen deer steaks, tossed one to Blue and one to Molly, because their anxious eyes told me they had heard what words could not convey. That night, I considered calling Dad in France. Midnight, there would be dawn in Paris. I imagined him on a balcony, worried. I shut the phone. Instead, I copied the camera images onto a thumb drive, tucked it behind the false backing of my dresser. Sleep came in slices, each dream a flash of bone antlers. Thursday pre-dawn. A pack of coyotes yipped near the pasture fence, then fell silent mid-howl. Blue stood pointing at the back door, hackles up. I cracked the door, flashlight sweeping. No, I shine. The world smelled only of dust. I spooked at every mesquite shadow, but no creature returned. Still, I called Ada, asking her to stay away a few days. She sensed the tremor beneath my words and argued, but I insisted. Over the following days, the ranch felt watched. Twice I spotted a lank figure at tree line. Both times it receded before my scope. Once, footprints appeared outside the barn, leading nowhere. I salted the perimeter, burned sage. An old superstition from Mom's grandmother, read psalms aloud. The dogs barked fewer times, calves nursed unbothered, and slowly the weight lifted. Whatever I hurt had either died deeper in the ravine or decided easier prey awaited elsewhere. When Mom and Dad returned, I met them with forced casual talk of water pump flow and feed prices. That evening, after Mom tucked imported chocolates into the pantry, Dad joined me on the porch. I handed him the thumb drive without a word, knowing the look in my eyes spoke volumes. He plugged it into his old laptop, browsed, and landed on the shot of the Wendigo crouched over the hide. His jaw tightened. After a long silence, he ejected the drive, set it on the railing, crushed it beneath his boot heel, scooped the pieces, and scuffed them into the dirt. He spoke softly. "This land's seen devils before. We don't memorialize them. We burned the rest of the hide at twilight, the smoke rising blue against a peach sky, crackling like cedar." Dad recited a Comanche cleansing verse taught by his grandfather. I repeated it line by line. That was 5 weeks ago. Since then, the ranch has resumed its measured dance of sunrise feedings, midday repairs, and moonlit checks. Yet sometimes the world tilts. A hush falls too abruptly. A waft of rotten musk slides on the breeze. When that happens, I stop whatever chore I am doing, listen until the hairs on my arms settle, then carry on. The .30-30 stays cleaned, oiled, and loaded behind the back door jamb. Ada visits again, and we sit on the tailgate watching distant storms crawl across the plains. But she notes my eyes still drift toward the treeline. I tell her only that a man must stay mindful of his place. I earned Dad's silent respect that week, though neither of us names the reason. At church potlucks, folks remark that I carry myself taller. Maybe so. When land gifts you 5 generations of stories, you owe that land vigilance. The Wendigo, or whatever name belongs to the thing of antlered bone, taught me the stakes. It also taught an older lesson Dad once grumbled to me while setting fence posts in August heat. You dig your post hole deep the first time, son, or the wind will dig it deeper by snapping your fence in two. I dug my courage deep in those woods. If the creature returns, it will find my boundary staked and reinforced, and this time I will not hesitate until it flees. I will hunt until sun cracks the horizon and shows me where its shadow ends. I have carried unusual stories in my family since childhood. Stories that threaded their way into every birthday gathering and every winter evening when the wind banged loose shutters against the siding. Those stories never felt like make-believe to me. They were woven into my bloodlines the way scars are woven into flesh. On my mother's side, the English branch, there was a great aunt people called a black witch. Nobody in the family ever wrote down her spells, but the tales disagreed on whether she whispered to the dead or simply kept the dead company. Around her stood uncles and cousins who practiced Wicca in gentle garden ways, herbal brews for coughs, moonlit prayers for safe travel, that sort of thing. On my father's side, the Cherokee branch, the legends spoke of long-gone medicine men and shamans who could walk the borders between the worlds of human beings and spirits. All those histories settled onto my shoulders, light as dust and heavy as stone. And by the time I was old enough to keep secrets, I already knew to speak softly when empty rooms felt crowded. Usually my odd inheritance was more gift than curse. I could tell if a house carried good memories or sad ones by the way the air quivered on my skin. Sometimes, late at night, I saw a thin silhouette in an open doorway and felt nothing but gentle curiosity. Just a traveler slipping through a place they once called home. I knew how to burn sage, how to draw a quiet line of salt, how to close a door if a spirit tried to linger too long. Even so, I was never reckless. There are things older than stories, and some of them do not care if you mean well. That warning became real in late autumn of 2019, when I was 23. I lived then in a small Washington town that hugged the lower slopes near Mount St. Helens. 10 miles in any direction and the forest swallowed you whole. People joked about Bigfoot the way city people joke about traffic jams, but the jokes were affectionate, like the idea of a quiet neighbor too shy to ring the bell. I worked long hours in a job that roughed up my nerves, so when my shifts ended I often drove forest roads. Something about the darkness beyond the windshield calmed me. It was as if the land itself wrapped around me and breathed slow until my heartbeat matched. Because of the late hours, and because my work occasionally drew unwanted attention, I carried a pistol. Nothing flashy, just a compact 9mm with 2 extra magazines tucked into the center console, plus a streamlight torch that could smash a window or blind a raccoon if needed. Dad had taught me to respect firearms the way you respect fire, useful but unforgiving of mistakes. One Friday night, after a shift that dragged me through every brand of irritation, I topped off my gas tank, grabbed coffee, and headed north into the logging roads. Rain had swept through earlier, leaving the asphalt streaked with silver under light from the quarter moon. I rolled the windows down. Cold, pine-scented air filled the car. Music played low. 15 minutes from town I crossed the county line, where the painted stripes disappeared and the Rayal forest began. The night was going well until I saw a sedan on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking. I eased past, scanning. Habit said look first, stop later. One driver, male, maybe mid-30s, knelt by a rear tire, shining a dim phone light on lug nuts. No crouching figures in the trees. No outline of someone hiding by the trunk. The scene felt genuine. I backed up 50 feet, got out, and offered help. He needed a signal to call roadside service. I had found a patch of service a mile uphill once before, so he climbed into my car and we made the call. 15 minutes later he was set, and we parted ways in good spirits. A small good deed, nothing more. But because the night was young and my coffee was still hot, I turned the car around and drove deeper. The road narrowed, then crossed a bridge I had driven over plenty of times. In daytime it was nothing special. Concrete slabs, chain-link fence bolted along both sides, a steep ravine underneath whispering with a thin creek. Tonight something new caught my eye. There was a hole in the fence, a rough, torn circle, big enough that a person could squeeze through if they wanted to. More curious than cautious, I parked, clipped the flashlight to my belt, and stepped into the hush. When the engine clicked itself into silence, I noticed a second sound. A metallic scrape, Not continuous, more like someone dragging a steel beam 2 feet, pausing, then dragging again. Each scrape vibrated faintly through the concrete deck of the bridge. I walked toward the hole, trying to see what lay on the far side. The fence didn't look cut. Instead, the links were ripped outward like claws hooking through chain and tearing back. Something about that tore open a small furnace of dread inside my chest. I swung my beam through the gap, down toward the creek. About 150 feet below, an orange traffic barrel lay on its side, perfectly centered between the water and the tree line. I couldn't explain how it got there. Maintenance crews didn't lug barrels into remote canyons. No road led below. Maybe a prank? Yet it rested so neatly, as if placed by an enormous, careful hand. The grinding sound grew louder, then stopped. Silence snapped like a rubber band. As I listened, a shape rose below. First one white hand, fingers ending in long, curved claws, gripping the bridge edge. Then a second hand. Smoothly, a pale head emerged, too elongated to be human. Skin pulled thin over bone, so that it flashed almost translucent beneath my flashlight. The pits of its eyes were glossy and black, reminding me of a shark's eyes, a kind of endless dark that feels alive. Where the nose might be, there was only a small ridge. The mouth was a thin horizontal slit. When it hissed, that slit widened just enough to show rows of thin, pointed teeth, and a stench rolled out, like spoiled meat and stagnant water forced through a vent. Years of family lore didn't cover this. Nothing in my grandmother's fireside tales told me how to face a thing climbing a bridge like a monstrous spider. Yet training overruled shock. I holstered the flashlight, drew the pistol, thumbed the light beneath the barrel, and fired. The muzzle flash flared, bright white, and bullets cracked into the thing's chest. Concrete spit dust. I doubt the first shots even registered as pain for that creature, but it did pause. In that pause, I saw its full height, easily 11 feet, knees set wrong, ribcage much too long. It stepped higher. I backed up, firing. 10 spent casings clinked across the deck. The slide locked. I slammed a fresh magazine, racked the action, fired again, kept advancing. Its movements struck me as almost curious, like a cat pawing a mouse before the bite. Somehow those calm, measured steps terrified me more than a wild rush would have. By the time my second magazine clicked dry, I was next to my car door. I dove inside, twisted the ignition, and stabbed the gas pedal. The rear wheels fishtailed before catching. As headlights swept the bridge's railing, I glimpsed the creature backing down, slipping underneath, returning to whatever dark corridor it had crawled from. The drive back to town flickered past like dream frames. Trees in the beams, hairpin turns, the hiss of tires on damp gravel. I opened the window, let cold air slap my face, reminded myself to breathe. By the time streetlights appeared, I had counted the entire alphabet backward twice. At my apartment, I retrieved a larger handgun and dialed Bill. Bill and I had shared campfires since high school. He respected the weird corners of the world, but had never walked into one. Now he listened while I told him, in a voice that shook less than I expected, what I'd seen. 5 minutes later, he was on my doorstep with a 12-gauge and an eager, half-terrified grin. We returned to the bridge. Everything looked quieter, as though the night had smoothed over its tracks. My brass casings lay where they had fallen. The hole yawned, edges jagged, but no pale hands reached through. Bill wanted to drop down the ravine to inspect the barrel. I vetoed that idea. The forest around us felt like a roomful of strangers who stopped talking the second we walked in. After an hour of tense waiting, we drove away, no wiser. Winter set in. Snow fell on logging spurs. Gradually, the memory slid from nightmare temperature to background hum. Then spring came, and with it Nicole. Nicole possessed a sensitivity that mirrored mine, though she hadn't grown up with stories to explain it. She simply felt things the way a person might feel pressure drop before a storm. We talked about ghosts on our second date and skipped the awkward laughter stage because neither of us needed to pretend disbelief. I told her I enjoyed night drives. She said she would love to see the forest under starlight. I did not immediately mention the bridge. 5 months after my bridge encounter, Nicole, Bill, and I loaded into my car. Early April nights were warmer, but the moon was new, so the forest pressed inward like wet cloth. As we drove, I finally recounted the story for Nicole in full detail. Bill punctuated my sentences with nods, affirming he had stood on the bridge afterward, seen the torn fence, the spent ammo, the lonely barrel. Nicole listened, hands folded in her lap, her brow furrowing deeper the closer we came to the mountain. 10 miles from the bridge, she began to tremble. She pulled her jacket tighter, though the dashboard heater blew steady warmth. At 5 miles, she asked, softly, "Tell me when we get close." I said, "We're already close." She closed her eyes, whispered something like a prayer or a grounding mantra. Bill watched her, uneasy. The bridge appeared around a bend. I slowed. Nicole gasped, a sharp intake of breath that sounded like the first step of a sob. All at once the car felt heavy, the air thick and mean. Then we saw the flowers. Someone had woven fresh wildflowers through the chain-link fence around the hole, bright yellows and purples and whites, a wreath of apology or of mourning. None of us spoke. I rolled to a stop on the bridge's shoulder. Nicole whispered, "Someone died here." The certainty in her voice sent goosebumps up my arms. "They were pulled through. That's why they left the flowers. You shot, it ran, but it got someone later." Before I could answer, a wave of grief washed over me. I felt tears fill my eyes. Bill cursed under his breath. It was as if a mother's cry for a lost child had been recorded on the wind and suddenly replayed at full volume inside our skulls. The sorrow lasted maybe 3 heartbeats. Then it flipped. The second wave was fury. Pure, seething hatred, not our own but poured into us, making my vision tighten to a tunnel. Nicole clutched the dashboard until her knuckles mottled white. Bill racked the shotgun before realizing the safety was already engaged. The rage wanted blood, any blood. Then, as quickly as it swelled, it drained away. The night returned to normal hush. Nicole let out a sob. I started the engine, turned us around, and drove until highway sodium lights replaced darkness. We dropped Bill first. He stepped out, shotgun hugged to his chest, and said, "I believe now." Nicole and I continued south. She told me the presence still hovered over her shoulders like frost. She feared it might follow her all the way to Portland. We cleansed her apartment with sage the next day. Nightmares followed her for months. Black pits for eyes, claws on concrete, flowers wilting as she screamed without sound. I never crossed that bridge again. Even sunshine couldn't wash away the memory of pale hands and the stench that rose with them. The forest, once a cathedral of green silence, now felt like a place with locked doors behind every trunk. Doors I had pried at my own risk. Some questions remain. Was the creature a skinwalker, a being from stories whispered by tribes far from Mount St. Helens? Was it something older, born of volcanic stone and ancient dark? An appetite given shape? I do not know. My family's lore offers hints but no answers. In Cherokee tales there are beings that wear the faces of animals that hunt humans, but those tales speak of taboos so strong they are not told aloud. My great-aunt's English grimoires mention fetches, spirits that mimic the living to collect souls, but none match the thing's claws or its size. Sometimes legends blur together where continents meet. I keep the spent casings in a jar now, dull brass marked by powder burn. A reminder that bullets might slow a nightmare but cannot bury it. A reminder that even a lifetime of strange experiences may leave you naked when something new crawls out of the dark. And a reminder that fear can be survived. That 3 people on a bridge, hearts rattling like tin cups, can still defy a shadow that has haunted ravines since long before asphalt and chain link. If you ever find yourself driving forest roads near Mount St. Helens and you come to a bridge where the fencing sags in a torn circle, keep your foot steady on the gas. Do not stop for curiosity, and do not pause for the loneliness of the night, no matter how loudly it calls. The forest has eyes deeper than darkness, and some of them know your name before you speak it. I was born and raised on a cattle and horse spread that my family has run for generations in West Texas. From the day I could climb a fence on my own, my father and grandfather taught me to be a rancher in the old way. Mend what breaks, treat every animal like a living investment, and ride the fence lines before dawn to make sure nothing two-legged or four-legged slipped through during the night. We own hundreds of open acres of grassland, but the heart of the place, the part that shaped my childhood most, lies in the tract of thick mesquite and scrub oak that crawls up the low hills at the back of the property. When the chores were done, I disappeared there on foot or on horseback, hunting rabbits, practicing my roping, or simply breathing the cedar and dust smell that tells you no town lies within miles. By the summer I turned 22, my older brother and sister had left the county for good jobs of their own. They still came home for Christmas and branding season, but the daily work was down to me, Dad, and whichever hired hands could stand the heat past a single season. That July my parents surprised us all by announcing a week-long trip to France, a gift they had postponed their whole marriage. Dad trusted me to keep the ranch running, and though he left a neighboring rancher's phone number, just in case, I knew he believed I could handle whatever came up. The first 2 days passed the way any ranch days pass when the mercury climbs into triple digits. Before sunrise I forked hay into the corrals, checked the mineral blocks at the far pasture, hauled salt and water for the horses, and patched a length of sagging barbed wire where a small group of yearlings had been scratching their necks. By mid-afternoon the sun hammered so hard even the cicadas quit buzzing. I parked myself under the porch roof with a glass of sweet tea and read 3 chapters of the old King James Bible Dad kept on a shelf by the door. That evening my girlfriend Sarah drove out in her little pickup to spend a few hours. We saddled 2 geldings and ambled along the creek at the back edge of the woods. The horses swished flies from their flanks. Sarah laughed when a jackrabbit spooked from a bunch of prickly pear. The light faded red and gold, and nothing about the day felt strange. The third morning dawned hot again, but a thin haze crawled the horizon, hinting at a storm that might build come nightfall. I hauled feed, trimmed a hoof on Dad's cutting mare, then fixed a plate of fried eggs and tortillas. Around noon Sarah texted to say work had kept her in town. She'd try to come the following afternoon instead. I used the free time to scrub water troughs, oil a bridle, and clean Dad's old Winchester .30-30 lever action. More for tradition than necessity. Though we do run into coyotes and the odd bobcat, West Texas long ago drove out most bigger predators, and modern fences keep even the ambitious scavengers at arm's length. Still, as dusk settled, I felt uneasy. The feeling started like a tickle behind the ears while I spread fresh hay in the main barn. The horses shifted restlessly, laying their ears flat though no thunder or gust of wind rattled the rafters. I double-checked the sliding doors, slipped the heavy oak beam across them, and headed outside to the cow barn 50 yards away. A lone heifer lowed in the pen. The sound echoed too sharp in the empty air. That was when the prickle on my neck turned to a full shiver. Someone or something was watching from the line of trees. I set Dad's rifle against the corral fence, cupped my hands around my mouth, and called toward the mesquites. "Evenin', this is private land. No harm if you head on out." Silence answered. The wind had dropped. Even the insects stayed mute. I squinted into the dark, and for half a heartbeat I caught sight of a silhouette leaning from behind a trunk. Taller than a man and somehow wrong in its angle, as if the limbs bent where they shouldn't. I blinked. The shape melted back into shadow. A trick of failing light, I told myself. A dead snag shaped like a figure. The cattle need comfort, not nerves, so I finished locking the barn and returned to the house porch. I set a country station low on the radio and rocked in Dad's wobbly chair, rifle resting across my thighs. The sky bruised from purple to black. Crickets finally resumed their chorus, and heat lightning flickered beyond the horizon. By 10 o'clock, I convinced myself the stranger shape was nothing but fatigue and tall tales. I turned off the radio, killed the porch lamp, and carried the Winchester inside. At 2 a.m., the ranch exploded with sound. Horses shrilled in the barn. Cows bawled like they smelled a slaughterhouse. I jolted from bed, grabbed the rifle and a flashlight, and sprinted barefoot through the dust. Moonlight silvered the yard. The big sliding door that I had barred with a 10-foot oak beam now gaped open, hinges twisted. Inside, straw scattered everywhere. In the center aisle lay one of the milk cows, neck laid open from jaw to shoulder, rib cage broken wide as if a giant fist had punched straight through and ripped out as it withdrew. Blood soaked the packed dirt. Steam rose thick as smoke. My stomach lurched hard enough I almost lost what dinner remained. No animal we knew could wreck a grown cow like that and then vanish before the shooter reached the barn. Even a bull might gore, but it would stay. The cattle crushed against the far wall shivering. I backed from the doorway, rifle tight to my shoulder, scanning the yard, the pens, the corner shadows. Nothing moved. The horror of the slaughter hardened to anger. Something had walked onto my land and murdered livestock that bore my family's brand. I decided right then that letting the thing slink away meant inviting it back. Dad's stories of cougar hunters and rogue wolf dogs flickered through my head. Yet none matched the silent doorway, the smooth split hide, the missing organs. Old Comanche lore tells of spirits that eat human flesh and taint the ground they tread. My grandmother's English notebooks describe demons wearing animal bones as masks. I never thought such stories literal. But I'd also never seen a cow cut open like butcher's parchment. At dawn, I dragged the carcass with the tractor. Instead of burying her in our bone pile, I hauled the body 2 miles into the backwoods along a rutted trail we seldom used. If some beast wanted meat, let it come claim the bait where my cameras could watch, and away from the remaining stock. I rigged a motion sensor trail cam to a live feed app on my phone, then drove back, locking every gate behind me. From late morning to late afternoon, nothing triggered the alert. At 4:30, the sky pushed black thunderheads up from the south. I smelled rain and static. The air felt bruised. I checked the live feed again. Still the forest clearing, the dead cow's flank swelling with early bloat, the frame empty. Evening settled. Lightning flashed, but no thunder yet. Just after 9, the phone buzzed. Motion detected. I tapped the screen. The first still photo loaded. Grainy green night vision. Something translucent white crouched over the carcass. Long limbs folded wrong. Spine arched like a bow straining against its own string. A second photo. The creature raised its head, skin stretched tight over skull, empty sockets glowing with faint caught light. The third photo stopped my breath. The thing had pivoted toward the camera, as though it felt the digital eye. Its mouth, if mouth it was, opened impossibly wide, exposing needle teeth in rows deeper than any predator on Earth. I shut the app. My chest hammered. Sarah was due next afternoon. No way I would let that horror roam near her. Dad's rifle suddenly felt as flimsy as a slingshot. I loaded a pack with extra ammunition, flares, 2 radios, and a hunting knife. I filled the canteen, whispered a prayer I half remembered from Sunday school, and drove the battered ranch truck to the trailhead. The storm had stalled overhead. Heavy clouds hid the moon. I killed the engine, stepped into the hush, and instantly regretted coming alone. Yet there was no turning back. I walked the last mile through a tunnel of cedar and pinyon, flashlight off, trusting dim lightning for guidance. Even the air smelled rotten now, sweet and sour like meat left in summer sun. I knelt, scanned. Nothing stirred except the sway of branches. The camera's LED blinked ahead on its post. Then came a voice behind me. "Run, boy." It wasn't spoken. It was breathed. Rasped so close to my ear I felt the words brush skin. The voice sounded like Dad at his sickest, fever-parched, hollow. I whirled, swung the rifle up. My light snapped on. 10 yards back along the trail stood the creature. His height on 2 legs cleared 8 feet easy. Skin gray-white, stretched, scars crisscrossing the rib cage where hair might once have grown. From its skull rose antlers, not deer antlers exactly, but jagged branches of bone splitting in irregular tines. Around its shoulders smaller antler shards jutted like thorns. The eyes were not eyes, liquid pits, reflecting only emptiness. I fired. The .30-30 thunder cracked the stillness. The recoil slammed my shoulder. A circle of dark blossomed in the creature's chest. Staggered but did not fall. I levered and fired again, each shot punching dusk-red pulps that closed near instantly as if the flesh forgot it should bleed. It screeched. A sound part human wail, part cougar scream pitched low enough to shake breath from lungs. The stench rolled harder. Lightning split the sky, revealing skeletal trees and the monster's silhouette against them. I kept shooting until the rifle clicked. The creature reeled, one hand pressed to its torso. It lurched into the brush with clumsy speed, as though hurt but furious. Branches cracked. Dark swallowed it. My flashlight beam shook across empty trunks. Rain finally broke, crashing through leaves. My ears rang. Every nerve screamed retreat, but anger held me. Anger that it dared exist here. I reloaded, edged toward the clearing. The cow carcass lay ripped wider, ribs bare. Around it, black blood spattered the dirt where my bullets had struck the thing. Drops smoked as the rain touched them. A branch snapped deeper ahead. Another. I glimpsed the creature's antlers bobbing among distant trees, retreating. And I understood, wounded or not, it would recover. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next season. And maybe next time it would take more than cattle. Some battles you win by living to lock the gates. I backed away, rifle ready. At the truck I chained the gate, then drove home under pounding rain. When Mom and Dad returned that weekend, they found me on the porch, rifle across my lap. I told them everything. Dad listened without interruption, eyes harder than glass. When I finished, he gripped my shoulder and said only, "You did what a man does. We'll hang new lights on the barns and never go back there alone." I burned sage in every doorway that night. Sarah visited the next day. I told her part of the story, enough to explain the new locks. She traced the bruise on my shoulder from the rifle and said she trusted my silence. Months slipped by. No cattle vanished. No figure watched from the treeline when I made evening rounds. Yet I keep the Winchester cleaned and ready. Some nights the wind shifts and carries a sour-sweet odor across the pastures. On those nights I walk the fences twice, whisper the old Cherokee words against hunger that devours the mind, and watch the woods until dawn. Because the old stories are not just stories. And because once you see a monster step into moonlight, you learn that home survives only by your vigilance, and by faith, whether in bullets, in prayers, or in the fragile human will not to be prey. I was 16 when that summer evening turned my idea of home into something I hardly recognize. It had been a grinding week of midsummer college assignments, papers to draft, lab work to finish, and a constant buzz of deadlines that shoved sleep to the bottom of my priorities. By Friday, I was running on nerves. Classes ended at noon, so I packed a duffel bag, slid into my old coupe, and drove the familiar 40-minute route west to my parents' house. Their place sits on a gentle rise behind a stand of hardwoods. Hickories, poplars, and oaks that rise in tight ranks, and then sweep down into a dense forest that covers most of the county line. The trees shelter the house from highway noise, and when daylight is generous the yard looks like a green bowl. At dusk, though, those same trees turn into black columns, and the thick undergrowth between them becomes a single rippling wall of shadow. I arrived around 5:30, let myself through the back door, and dropped my duffel on the kitchen bench. Dad was out of town on a consulting job, Mom was finishing a double shift at the hospital, and my younger brother was on a school band trip. Their absence left the house unnaturally quiet. Only the dogs greeted me. 5 of them in various shapes and sizes, wagging and whining as if I had been gone for years. Winston, the big English Mastiff, nudged everyone aside with his massive skull and leaned his whole weight against my legs. He was almost 170 pounds, horse-sized from some angles, absurdly gentle from others, and whenever I felt anxious his presence settled me. I ruffled the loose folds around his neck, filled a bowl of water for him, then headed onto the deck to let the day drain out of my head. The deck faces east, toward the forest. In daylight I can see a thin ribbon of creek that cuts away into the trees, but by 6 that evening the shadows had already stretched halfway across the lawn. A faint humidity, born of late afternoon heat and river vapor, thickened the air. Normally cicadas would be sawing the sky into equal halves of noise, but that evening they seemed to have bowed out early. Winston followed and lowered himself next to my chair with a grunt that rattled the boards. I scrolled news on my phone, sipped lukewarm iced tea, and told myself that if I stared at leaves long enough the knots in my mind would loosen. But a grain of unease kept rolling under my ribs. It was as if something in the forest was aware of me, or worse, waiting. At 6:30, a shrill volley of barking shattered the stillness. The racket belonged to our nearest neighbor's mutt. a loping shepherd mix who barked at squirrels, at diesel trucks, sometimes at his own reflection in puddles. That evening he went at it as though every trespass in the world had to be protested at once. Frantic barks punctuated by low, gutty growls. I rose, leaned over the railing, and hollered toward the woods. "Hey, quiet down, will you?" It was reflex more than expectation. No dog will hush for a stranger's voice. The barking stuttered but climbed again. For minutes into the uproar, an unearthly shriek sawed through the trees. The sound was not canine. Too raw, too deep, laden with something that made my scalp prickle. Think of metal on slate amplified through a guttural throat that can widen beyond any natural jawline. Then abrupt silence fell. No whine, no scuttling, just void. Even the neighbor's mutt, visible from the deck as a silhouette near the property line, stopped mid-growl. His posture quivered, tail tucked, and he bolted toward the house as if swatted by invisible claws. That was when I saw movement behind him. At first the shapes seemed like wind-blown shadows. Narrow, black, folding among the trunks. They glided between trees with no branch snap, no underbrush rustle. A haze of dusk hovered just bright enough for outlines but too dim for detail. I could not count how many shapes there were. They drifted left and right as if schooling fish masquerading as darkness. Winston's head jerked up. His lips peeled from his gums in a deep vibrato growl, hackles rising along shoulders that looked suddenly cannon broad. I swear that dog's growl vibrated the deck rail. The shapes paused. Or maybe they huddled. Whatever they did, they became still. All at once a second scream erupted brighter, closer, laced with an ache that drilled behind the eyes. Winston barked, a thundercrack sound that startled even me, and the shapes recoiled deeper into the tree line. I exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd reserved. Then the shadows burst forward. They moved faster than running deer, more like gusts. They tore across 30, 40 yards in seconds, gaining where forest thinned toward grass. I grabbed Winston's collar, swung open the French door behind us, and shoved the mastiff inside. His nails skittered on tile as I slammed the door and clicked the deadbolt. Heart drumming, I pivoted toward the window. The lawn, silvered by twilight, looked calm. Yet silhouettes now dotted the edge of deck beams, perched or squatting, impossible to distinguish except by contrast on lighter boards. Their heads cocked in unnatural angles, as though listening to frequencies beyond human range. Too many joints, too sharp elbows, too elongated fingers, if they were fingers at all. A tremor shook the floorboards. Thud. Another. Thud. Winston, inside the kitchen, barked ferociously. I stood frozen as the deck railing quivered. Emerging from the forest, something massive approached. Upright, swaying, deliberate. As it stepped into clearing, porch lights bounced from its form. It dwarfed the shapes that scattered before it like crows. 11 feet tall, perhaps more, covered in coarse, patchy hair that revealed gray skin beneath. But its face stopped thought. Imagine a skull engineered for carnage, lengthened into a muzzle, yet stripped so raw that cartilage hung like tattered ribbons. Tattered pieces of flesh clung where ears might have grown. Sunken sockets glowed with yellow light, as if something molten had pooled inside. The creature lifted its head, locked onto me behind the glass. I lost all language. Fear became physical, burrowing under ribs, tightening throat, clouding vision. For maybe half a second creature and human held each other in a private tableau. Then it shrieked, same noise amplified. Window panes rattled. A mug toppled on the counter behind me. I was 16 when that summer evening turned my idea of home into something I hardly recognize. It had been a grinding week of midsummer college assignments, papers to draft, lab work to finish, and a constant buzz of deadlines that shoved sleep to the bottom of my priorities. By Friday, I was running on nerves. Classes ended at noon, so I packed a duffel bag, slid into my old coupe, and drove the familiar 40-minute route west to my parents' house. Their place sits on a gentle rise behind a stand of hardwoods. Hickories, poplars, and oaks that rise in tight ranks, and then sweep down into a dense forest that covers most of the county line. The trees shelter the house from highway noise, And when daylight is generous, the yard looks like a green bowl. At dusk, though, those same trees turn into black columns, and the thick undergrowth between them becomes a single rippling wall of shadow. I arrived around 5:30, let myself through the back door, and dropped my duffel on the kitchen bench. Dad was out of town on a consulting job, Mom was finishing a double shift at the hospital, and my younger brother was on a school band trip. Their absence left the house unnaturally quiet. Only the dogs greeted me. 5 of them in various shapes and sizes, wagging and whining as if I had been gone for years. Winston, the big English Mastiff, nudged everyone aside with his massive skull and leaned his whole weight against my legs. He was almost 170 pounds, horse-sized from some angles, absurdly gentle from others, and whenever I felt anxious his presence settled me. I ruffled the loose folds around his neck, filled a bowl of water for him, then headed onto the deck to let the day drain out of my head. The deck faces east, toward the forest. In daylight I can see a thin ribbon of creek that cuts away into the trees, but by 6 that evening the shadows had already stretched halfway across the lawn. A faint humidity, born of late afternoon heat and river vapor, thickened the air. Normally cicadas would be sawing the sky into equal halves of noise, but that evening they seemed to have bowed out early. Winston followed and lowered himself next to my chair with a grunt that rattled the boards. I scrolled news on my phone, sipped lukewarm iced tea, and told myself that if I stared at leaves long enough the knots in my mind would loosen. But a grain of unease kept rolling under my ribs. It was as if something in the forest was aware of me, or worse, waiting. At 6:30, a shrill volley of barking shattered the stillness. The racket belonged to our nearest neighbor's mutt, a loping shepherd mix who barked at squirrels, at diesel trucks, sometimes at his own reflection in puddles. That evening he went at it as though every trespass in the world had to be protested at once. Frantic barks punctuated by low, gutty growls. I rose, leaned over the railing, and hollered toward the woods. "Hey, quiet down, will you?" It was reflex more than expectation. No dog will hush for a stranger's voice. The barking stuttered but climbed again. For minutes into the uproar, an unearthly shriek sawed through the trees. The sound was not canine. Too raw, too deep, laden with something that made my scalp prickle. Think of metal on slate amplified through a guttural throat that can widen beyond any natural jawline. Then abrupt silence fell. No whine, no scuttling, just void. Even the neighbor's mutt, visible from the deck as a silhouette near the property line, stopped mid-growl. His posture quivered, tail tucked, and he bolted toward the house as if swatted by invisible claws. That was when I saw movement behind him. At first the shapes seemed like wind-blown shadows. Narrow, black, folding among the trunks. They glided between trees with no branch snap, no underbrush rustle. A haze of dusk hovered just bright enough for outlines but too dim for detail. I could not count how many shapes there were. They drifted left and right as if schooling fish masquerading as darkness. Winston's head jerked up. His lips peeled from his gums in a deep vibrato growl, hackles rising along shoulders that looked suddenly cannon broad. I swear that dog's growl vibrated the deck rail. The shapes paused. Or maybe they huddled. Whatever they did, they became still. All at once a second scream erupted brighter, closer, laced with an ache that drilled behind the eyes. Winston barked, a thundercrack sound that startled even me, and the shapes recoiled deeper into the tree line. I exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd reserved. Then the shadows burst forward. They moved faster than running deer, more like gusts. They tore across 30, 40 yards in seconds, gaining where forest thinned toward grass. I grabbed Winston's collar, swung open the French door behind us, and shoved the mastiff inside. His nails skittered on tile as I slammed the door and clicked the deadbolt. Heart drumming, I pivoted toward the window. The lawn, silvered by twilight, looked calm. Yet silhouettes now dotted the edge of deck beams, perched or squatting, impossible to distinguish except by contrast on lighter boards. Their heads cocked in unnatural angles, as though listening to frequencies beyond human range. Too many joints, too sharp elbows, too elongated fingers, if they were fingers at all. A tremor shook the floorboards. Thud. Another. Thud. Winston, inside the kitchen, barked ferociously. I stood frozen as the deck railing quivered. Emerging from the forest, something massive approached. Upright, swaying, deliberate. As it stepped into clearing, porch lights bounced from its form. It dwarfed the shapes that scattered before it like crows. 11 feet tall, perhaps more, covered in coarse, patchy hair that revealed gray skin beneath. But its face stopped thought. Imagine a skull engineered for carnage, lengthened into a muzzle, yet stripped so raw that cartilage hung like tattered ribbons. Tattered pieces of flesh clung where ears might have grown. Sunken sockets glowed with yellow light, as if something molten had pooled inside. The creature lifted its head, locked onto me behind the glass. I lost all language. Fear became physical, burrowing under ribs, tightening throat, clouding vision. For maybe half a second, creature and human held each other in a private tableau. Then it shrieked, same noise amplified. Window panes rattled. A mug toppled on the counter behind me. I was 16 when that summer evening turned my idea of home into something I hardly recognize. It had been a grinding week of midsummer college assignments, papers to draft, lab work to finish, and a constant buzz of deadlines that shoved sleep to the bottom of my priorities. By Friday, I was running on nerves. Classes ended at noon, so I packed a duffel bag, slid into my old coupe, and drove the familiar 40-minute route west to my parents' house. Their place sits on a gentle rise behind a stand of hardwoods. Hickories, poplars, and oaks that rise in tight ranks, and then sweep down into a dense forest that covers most of the county line. The trees shelter the house from highway noise, and when daylight is generous, the yard looks like a green bowl. At dusk, though, those same trees turn into black columns, and the thick undergrowth between them becomes a single rippling wall of shadow. I arrived around 5:30, let myself through the back door, and dropped my duffel on the kitchen bench. Dad was out of town on a consulting job, Mom was finishing a double shift at the hospital, and my younger brother was on a school band trip. Their absence left the house unnaturally quiet. Only the dogs greeted me. 5 of them in various shapes and sizes, wagging and whining as if I had been gone for years. Winston, the big English Mastiff, nudged everyone aside with his massive skull and leaned his whole weight against my legs. He was almost 170 pounds, horse-sized from some angles, absurdly gentle from others, and whenever I felt anxious his presence settled me. I ruffled the loose folds around his neck, filled a bowl of water for him, then headed onto the deck to let the day drain out of my head. The deck faces east, toward the forest. In daylight I can see a thin ribbon of creek that cuts away into the trees, but by 6 that evening the shadows had already stretched halfway across the lawn. A faint humidity, born of late afternoon heat and river vapor, thickened the air. Normally cicadas would be sawing the sky into equal halves of noise, but that evening they seemed to have bowed out early. Winston followed and lowered himself next to my chair with a grunt that rattled the boards. I scrolled news on my phone, sipped lukewarm iced tea, and told myself that if I stared at leaves long enough the knots in my mind would loosen. But a grain of unease kept rolling under my ribs. It was as if something in the forest was aware of me, or worse, waiting. At 6:30, a shrill volley of barking shattered the stillness. The racket belonged to our nearest neighbor's mutt, a loping shepherd mix who barked at squirrels, at diesel trucks, sometimes at his own reflection in puddles. That evening he went at it as though every trespass in the world had to be protested at once. Frantic barks punctuated by low, gutty growls. I rose, leaned over the railing, and hollered toward the woods. "Hey, quiet down, will you?" It was reflex more than expectation. No dog will hush for a stranger's voice. The barking stuttered but climbed again. For minutes into the uproar, an unearthly shriek sawed through the trees. The sound was not canine. Too raw, too deep, laden with something that made my scalp prickle. Think of metal on slate amplified through a guttural throat that can widen beyond any natural jawline. Then abrupt silence fell. No whine, no scuttling, just void. Even the neighbor's mutt, visible from the deck as a silhouette near the property line, stopped mid-growl. His posture quivered, tail tucked, and he bolted toward the house as if swatted by invisible claws. That was when I saw movement behind him. At first the shapes seemed like wind-blown shadows. Narrow, black, folding among the trunks. They glided between trees with no branch snap, no underbrush rustle. A haze of dusk hovered just bright enough for outlines but too dim for detail. I could not count how many shapes there were. They drifted left and right as if schooling fish masquerading as darkness. Winston's head jerked up. His lips peeled from his gums in a deep vibrato growl, hackles rising along shoulders that looked suddenly cannon broad. I swear that dog's growl vibrated the deck rail. The shapes paused. Or maybe they huddled. Whatever they did, they became still. All at once a second scream erupted brighter, closer, laced with an ache that drilled behind the eyes. Winston barked, a thundercrack sound that startled even me, and the shapes recoiled deeper into the tree line. I exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd reserved. Then the shadows burst forward. They moved faster than running deer, more like gusts. They tore across 30, 40 yards in seconds, gaining where forest thinned toward grass. I grabbed Winston's collar, swung open the French door behind us, and shoved the mastiff inside. His nails skittered on tile as I slammed the door and clicked the deadbolt. Heart drumming, I pivoted toward the window. The lawn, silvered by twilight, looked calm. Yet silhouettes now dotted the edge of deck beams, perched or squatting, impossible to distinguish except by contrast on lighter boards. Their heads cocked in unnatural angles, as though listening to frequencies beyond human range. Too many joints, too sharp elbows, too elongated fingers, if they were fingers at all. A tremor shook the floorboards. Thud. Another. Thud. Winston, inside the kitchen, barked ferociously. I stood frozen as the deck railing quivered. Emerging from the forest, something massive approached. Upright, swaying, deliberate. As it stepped into clearing, porch lights bounced from its form. It dwarfed the shapes that scattered before it like crows. 11 feet tall, perhaps more, covered in coarse, patchy hair that revealed gray skin beneath. But its face stopped thought. Imagine a skull engineered for carnage, lengthened into a muzzle, yet stripped so raw that cartilage hung like tattered ribbons. Tattered pieces of flesh clung where ears might have grown. Sunken sockets glowed with yellow light, as if something molten had pooled inside. The creature lifted its head, locked onto me behind the glass. I lost all language. Fear became physical, burrowing under ribs, tightening throat, clouding vision. For maybe half a second creature and human held each other in a private tableau. Then it shrieked, same noise amplified. Window panes rattled. A mug toppled on the counter behind me. I was 16 when that summer evening turned my idea of home into something I hardly recognize. It had been a grinding week of midsummer college assignments, papers to draft, lab work to finish, and a constant buzz of deadlines that shoved sleep to the bottom of my priorities. By Friday, I was running on nerves. Classes ended at noon, so I packed a duffel bag, slid into my old coupe, and drove the familiar 40-minute route west to my parents' house. Their place sits on a gentle rise behind a stand of hardwoods. Hickories, poplars, and oaks that rise in tight ranks, and then sweep down into a dense forest that covers most of the county line. The trees shelter the house from highway noise, and when daylight is generous the yard looks like a green bowl. At dusk, though, those same trees turn into black columns, and the thick undergrowth between them becomes a single rippling wall of shadow. I arrived around 5:30, let myself through the back door, and dropped my duffel on the kitchen bench. Dad was out of town on a consulting job, Mom was finishing a double shift at the hospital, and my younger brother was on a school band trip. Their absence left the house unnaturally quiet. Only the dogs greeted me. 5 of them in various shapes and sizes, wagging and whining as if I had been gone for years. Winston, the big English mastiff, nudged everyone aside with his massive skull and leaned his whole weight against my legs. He was almost 170 pounds, horse-sized from some angles, absurdly gentle from others, and whenever I felt anxious his presence settled me. I ruffled the loose folds around his neck, filled a bowl of water for him, then headed onto the deck to let the day drain out of my head. The deck faces east, toward the forest. In daylight, I can see a thin ribbon of creek that cuts away into the trees, but by 6 that evening the shadows had already stretched halfway across the lawn. A faint humidity, born of late afternoon heat and river vapor, thickened the air. Normally cicadas would be sawing the sky into equal halves of noise, but that evening they seemed to have bowed out early. Winston followed and lowered himself next to my chair with a grunt that rattled the boards. I scrolled news on my phone, sipped lukewarm iced tea, and told myself that if I stared at leaves long enough the knots in my mind would loosen. But a grain of unease kept rolling under my ribs. It was as if something in the forest was aware of me, or worse, waiting. At 6:30, a shrill volley of barking shattered the stillness. The racket belonged to our nearest neighbor's mutt, a loping shepherd mix who barked at squirrels, at diesel trucks, sometimes at his own reflection in puddles. That evening he went at it as though every trespass in the world had to be protested at once. Frantic barks punctuated by low, gutty growls. I rose, leaned over the railing, and hollered toward the woods. "Hey, quiet down, will you?" It was reflex more than expectation. No dog will hush for a stranger's voice. The barking stuttered but climbed again. For minutes into the uproar, an unearthly shriek sawed through the trees. The sound was not canine. Too raw, too deep, laden with something that made my scalp prickle. Think of metal on slate amplified through a guttural throat that can widen beyond any natural jawline. Then abrupt silence fell. No whine, no scuttling, just void. Even the neighbor's mutt, visible from the deck as a silhouette near the property line, stopped mid-growl. His posture quivered, tail tucked, and he bolted toward the house as if swatted by invisible claws. That was when I saw movement behind him. At first the shapes seemed like wind-blown shadows, narrow, black, folding among the trunks. They glided between trees with no branch snap, no underbrush rustle. A haze of dusk hovered just bright enough for outlines but too dim for detail. I could not count how many shapes there were. They drifted left and right as if schooling fish masquerading as darkness. Winston's head jerked up. His lips peeled from his gums in a deep vibrato growl, hackles rising along shoulders that looked suddenly cannon broad. I swear that dog's growl vibrated the deck rail. The shapes paused. Or maybe they huddled. Whatever they did, they became still. All at once a second scream erupted brighter, closer, laced with an ache that drilled behind the eyes. Winston barked, a thundercrack sound that startled even me, and the shapes recoiled deeper into the tree line. I exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd reserved. Then the shadows burst forward. They moved faster than running deer, more like gusts. They tore across 30, 40 yards in seconds, gaining where forest thinned toward grass. I grabbed Winston's collar, swung open the French door behind us, and shoved the mastiff inside. His nails skittered on tile as I slammed the door and clicked the deadbolt. Heart drumming, I pivoted toward the window. The lawn, silvered by twilight, looked calm. Yet silhouettes now dotted the edge of deck beams, perched or squatting, impossible to distinguish except by contrast on lighter boards. Their heads cocked in unnatural angles, as though listening to frequencies beyond human range. Too many joints, too sharp elbows, too elongated fingers, if they were fingers at all. A tremor shook the floorboards. Thud. Another. Thud. Winston, inside the kitchen, barked ferociously. I stood frozen as the deck railing quivered. Emerging from the forest, something massive approached. Upright, swaying, deliberate. As it stepped into clearing, porch lights bounced from its form. It dwarfed the shapes that scattered before it like crows. 11 feet tall, perhaps more, covered in coarse, patchy hair that revealed gray skin beneath. But its face stopped thought. Imagine a skull engineered for carnage, lengthened into a muzzle, yet stripped so raw that cartilage hung like tattered ribbons. Tattered pieces of flesh clung where ears might have grown. Sunken sockets glowed with yellow light, as if something molten had pooled inside. The creature lifted its head, locked onto me behind the glass. I lost all language. Fear became physical, burrowing under ribs, tightening throat, clouding vision. For maybe half a second creature and human held each other in a private tableau. Then it shrieked, same noise amplified. Window panes rattled. A mug toppled on the counter behind me. We left for the state park on the second Friday of July, shortly after dawn, when the air still tasted cool enough to promise a tolerable day. In the weeks before, our father, who spent most of his years sweating under hissing industrial lights at the machine shop, had convinced himself that a single-family camping trip would patch up everything he worried was unraveling among us. Mom often teased him that he was married to the milling machines and the night shift. He would smile, guilt flickering behind his eyes, then kiss the top of her head and claim he was saving for a bigger house, better schools, something more. My brother, Lane, and my little sister, Emily, rolled their eyes each time the speech resurfaced. I mostly kept quiet and drew comics in the margins of my notebooks, anything to tune out the tension. So when Dad announced a 3-day vacation into the green lungs of Tennessee, Mom applauded the idea. Lane groaned that the campground had no Wi-Fi. Emily declared she had nothing to wear in murderbug country. And I clapped along with Mom because it felt kinder than pointing out the obvious. Dad wouldn't get more than 24 hours before work began buzzing his phone again. Still, the thought of a thick forest, an open sky, and a river wide enough for pedal boats did sound like a version of peace I hadn't tasted in a long while. We packed the sedan until the trunk bulged like an overstuffed suitcase. Sleeping bags, 2 nylon tents, collapsible chairs, a battered cooler older than I was, half a dozen fishing poles, a crate of canned chili, and Dad's plastic tackle box filled with colored spinners and bobbers. Everything wedged into corners and crevices. Mom slipped a paperback mystery novel between rolls of toilet paper. Lane stuffed his handheld game console into the glove compartment, even though Dad had banned electronics. Emily snuck a pouch of glittery nail polish and hair clips down the sleeve of her sweater because she refused to look like a caveman in family photos. I slipped my worn sketch pads into my backpack and sharpened 3 graphite pencils. HB, 2B, for B. Determined to catch whatever wildlife would sit still long enough. The drive south wound through long ribbons of highway, past sleepy towns where rusted water towers leaned over sagging barns. Mom tapped country songs on the steering wheel. Dad, giddy as a Boy Scout, kept pointing out every roadside bait shop and declaring which lures would hook the biggest bass. Lane stared at his phone until the signal bars vanished. When he grumbled, Dad threatened to make him walk the rest of the way. Emily laughed until Dad gave her the same ultimatum. By the time we reached the campground sign, a sun-bleached plank carved with a black bear and an arrow, late morning had already tipped toward noon. A single-lane gravel road led through a tunnel of poplars, maples, and shaggy hickories. Sunlight mottled the windshield like a kaleidoscope. Squirrels darted and my mother squealed at each close call. Finally, the forest opened onto a clearing beside a slow, gleaming ribbon of water. There, tethered to a crooked plank dock, floated 3 red pedal boats whose paint had faded into shades of dusty rose. A triangular wooden sign, posted at the dock's entrance, read, "Life jackets required. No swimming without supervision. All fish catch and release." Dad killed the engine. Everything fell deliciously quiet. No traffic, no leaf blowers, no buzzing fluorescent lamps. Just a thrumming chorus of cicadas, a faraway woodpecker hammering on a hollow trunk, and water lapping against the muddy bank. "Home sweet home," Dad announced, stepping out with his arms stretched wide as if he could hug the entire forest. The rest of us followed, blinking into the light, stretching kinks from hours of sitting. In that single breath, I allowed myself to believe Dad's vision might actually work. 3 days of calm, unity, maybe even laughter. We divided chores. Mom and I would pitch the larger tent for her and Dad. Lane would help me set the small 2-person tent I'd saved for months to buy. Emily, fairly useless with knots, was tasked with hauling lighter gear and sorting canned goods. Dad unfolded his camp chair on a patch of grass that gave him a line of sight to the river. He clipped lures to 2 rods, drove steel rod holders into the soil, and cast the lines with practiced flicks of his wrist. When the bobbers landed, plunking once before steadying among rings of ripples, he sighed like a man exhaling an entire year's burdens. Noon melted into afternoon. Dad stared at the water, waiting for a tug. Mom flipped pages of her mystery, occasionally glancing over the book to share a smile with him. Lane walked in slow circles, searching for a cellular bar that never appeared. Emily sprinkled glitter on her nails and scowled at a mosquito, and I wandered into the fringe of the woods with my sketchbook, hoping for a deer or even a lazy turtle to pose. That was when the hush arrived. Not immediately, not like a slammed door, but gradually, the way a shadow lengthens without your noticing until it has covered your feet. First the cicadas dulled, their static shrill losing volume. Then the woodpecker went silent, as though its beak froze mid-strike. At the same time the breeze fell away, air thickening around me. Even the smell changed. The green scent of leaves, the tang of river algae, everything seemed muted, replaced by a faint metallic taste coating the back of my tongue. My skin prickled. I thought maybe I'd wandered too far. Maybe storm clouds were moving in, though the sky remained a perfect cobalt dome between branches. Dad brandished the knife. Back off. One creature stepped forward. It opened its mouth. What poured out was not language. The screech from the forest hours earlier, amplified, frayed by its own volume. Grass flattened around its feet. Wind whooshed outward. Mom dropped the flashlight. The beam spun across the river, died facing weeds. Darkness devoured color. Only the fading campfire showed shapes. Black bodies, Father's trembling silhouette, Emily clutching my arm. A second creature lunged, not toward us, but toward the dock. It moved like water poured uphill, fluid, wrong. Reaching the rope that tethered the pedal boats, it lifted one vessel with absurd ease, fingers punching through fiberglass. Then it hurled. The boat whipped into tree trunks with a crash like a clap of thunder, plastic shattering, leaves raining. Dad yelled for us to run. Mom grabbed Emily, Lane grabbed me, and we sprinted toward the car. The key fob glowed in Dad's hand but beeped uselessly at first. He fumbled, clicked again. Doors unlocked with dry pops. We piled in, Emily sobbing. Dad fired the engine. Headlights carved twin tunnels through trees, illuminating just enough to see the creatures loping after us at the edge of beams, their joints stuttering like stop-motion puppets. Gravel sprayed as Dad reversed, then jerked forward onto the narrow track. Branches slapped the windows. Mom twisted to watch them recede, murmuring disbelief. Lane stared straight ahead, muttering, "Oh God," over and over. I clutched sketchbooks to my chest, the graphite points snapping inside. Half a mile later, we burst onto the state road, tires squealing on asphalt. Dad didn't slow until city lights glowed on the horizon. Even then, he kept one hand white-knuckled on the wheel. We reached a motel near midnight. "No vacancy," said the clerk, until Dad pressed a $100 bill on the counter. We crowded into a double room. The TV remained off. Nobody wanted sound. Only fluorescent bathroom light burned, half-closed door casting a thin stripe across carpet. Emily fell asleep instantly, exhaustion beating fear. Lane dozed fitful in a chair. Mom perched on the bed, feet tucked beneath her, staring at the blank screen. Dad paced until dawn. Morning sun painted the room a calm deceit. Dad returned to camp with 2 rangers. The rest of us waited at a diner. When he came back, he wore shock like frost. He said the site was wrecked. Tents shredded, coolers ripped open, fishing rods snapped. Pieces of pedal boat littered 50 yards of shoreline. Rangers blamed black bears high on dumpster trash. Dad didn't argue. We drove home. Dad returned to work nights, but something in him stayed back in those trees. Mom quit her mystery novels and started therapy. Lane no longer whined about Wi-Fi. He kept a baseball bat beside his bed. Emily slept with lights on. I filled sketchbooks with shapes of shadow, yellow eyes blinking in graphite dusk. Sometimes Dad stands at the kitchen window long after midnight, staring into suburban dark as if waiting for a screech that travels farther than sound should. If anyone asks how the camping trip went, he smiles too quickly and says, "Never caught a single fish." He leaves out the part about creatures that walk wrong, about boats thrown like toys, about silence that presses on your skull until you feel your heartbeat stumble. I still draw animals, deer, owls, rabbits, anything that will sit still long enough. Yet when my pencil drifts on its own, it finds tall figures at trees' edges, arms too long, heads too narrow, eyes flickering. Then I turn the page and sketch something with feathers instead, breathing easier so long as I don't shade the eyes the color of damp matches. Dad once asked if we should try camping again, maybe at a lake closer to home. I told him I'd rather keep my memories confined to paper, where graphite monsters can be erased. He nodded and didn't bring it up again. But on certain nights, when the neighborhood dogs launch into a frenzy that halts just as abruptly, when cicadas cease their electric static, when distant wind smells faintly metallic, I sit up in bed and feel the same hush that fell before the screech. I hold a flashlight in one hand and a broken pencil in the other, as if either could defend against whatever learned how to hurl a pedal boat across a clearing. In my mind, I hear Dad's voice daring shadows to back off, Emily's scream, the creature's impossible cry. After those nights, I sometimes dream of water, of a dock without boats, of fish swimming beneath shattered polyglass shards. I wake before dawn, walk to the kitchen, and find Dad already at the window. He doesn't ask what kept me awake. I don't ask him why he never fishes anymore. We stand together until birdsong finally stirs outside, the real kind that belongs to daylight, and only then dare we tell ourselves the hush has passed, for now. I was 17 that summer, worn thin by advanced placement homework, entrance exam practice, and teachers who insisted that every quiz, every essay, every formula would decide the rest of my life. One Thursday evening, I strangled another practice test, tore it in half, and decided that if I stayed inside 1 second more my head would explode. Behind our house stretched a narrow entrance my father had cut years before, just enough for a person to slip past the property line and disappear beneath the hardwoods. The sun was sliding toward the ridgeline when I laced up my old hiking boots, stuffed a half-charged flashlight into my pocket, and stepped through the opening. The first breaths of green air calmed me the way textbooks never could. A deer path curved along a shallow creek. I wandered without map or purpose, letting my boots choose. At a damp bend the mud held perfect tracks. Small, neat, dog-shaped, probably coyote. I had read field guides, watched documentaries. Coyotes lived here, half-ghosts on the suburban fringe. Proving to no one but myself that my tracking notes meant something, I began following the prints upstream. They ran straight for nearly a quarter mile, fading and reappearing on moss, leaf litter, smooth clay. The woods deepened, air cooler. I was alone with the knock of a distant woodpecker and the trickle of water folding over stones. That was when the tracks changed. The tidy little paw marks blurred, stretched, as if the animal had started to sprint, claws sliding. But after 3, 4, 5 prints, the shape was entirely different. Long, narrow, almost human, but elongated, toes splayed like a child signing her name inside wet cement. My first thought, mud distorts everything. Maybe 2 animals overlapped. Maybe the coyote leaped, skidded, dragged. I muttered these explanations, though none sounded firm. The sun kissed the treetops. I glanced at my watch, 7 o'clock. Enough time to reverse course before dusk. I turned, found my outbound trail of size 12 boot marks, and started back. 2 minutes later, I saw a third trail crossing mine. Fresh, deep, unmissable. The shape was wrong for any creature I knew. It struck like a hoof, yet not twin crescents but a pointed split, edges chipped as if from brittle horn. The stride was wrong too, nothing lumbering on 4. Each mark landed one before the other, left, right, left, bipedal. Cocked my head, listening. The ordinary woodland chatter had thinned. Cicadas still buzzed, but birds had dropped into pockets of hush. My skin tightened. I reminded myself that rabid animals stagger, humans sometimes trespass, footprints lie. Then, behind me, my own name floated through the trees. Exact pitch and color of my voice, but smothered, muffled, as though spoken into a pillow. I spun. No one. The creek, when quiet, sounds high like wind in a bottle. I backed along the path, eyes on every flicker. The hush now pressed like water around eardrums. Dead leaves crackled behind me, 2 steps, deliberate. I bolted. Branches lashed my arms. My cheeks stung from unseen twigs. I glimpsed dusk between trunks, a pale, dim tunnel to the yard. I cleared the tree-line and barreled across lawn, lungs stabbing. I flung open our back door, slammed and leaned until my knees quit. Inside smelled of dinner and detergent civilization. I forced a laugh at the panic, swore I'd watch less late-night horror. 2 days passed ordinary. No voices, no tracks. Homework still piled, but I felt steadier. Late Saturday afternoon frustration resurfaced. I threw on jeans, tugged the same boots, didn't bother with double knots. At the threshold of trees, I promised myself to stay near the creek and return before dark. 50 yards in, I found hoofprints, enormous, sunken deep. Deer, I guessed, but bigger than any whitetail. And walking upright again, single file. I didn't like that thought, but curiosity tugged sorrows aside. Tracking calmed me. It required geometry and imagination, a different kind of proof than grades. I followed. The prints wove between oaks, over a patch of stony ground, back into soft moss. I noted stride longer than mine. I saw impressions where ankles might flex too far to belong to hooves. I hesitated, thinking I should turn around, then heard a twig snap 15 feet ahead. 2 yellow coins hovered in shadow, eyes set too high, too far apart. The skull around them caught waning light. A deer skull, stripped white, mounted atop something tall. The antlers, if antlers existed, were gone, stumps only. I froze. What the heck? I blurted. I was never one of those people who get spooked easily. Growing up in rural South Carolina, I spent more evenings than I can count wandering the fields behind my parents' place, chasing fireflies or listening to whip-poor wills sing the twilight in. I learned early which noises belonged to which animals, which night silhouettes were nothing more than wind-shaken branches, and which smells meant a dead possum rotting somewhere downwind. By my mid-20s, I could sit on a dark porch for hours without flinching. When my husband Calvin and I started dating, he teased me about it, said I was braver than he'd ever be. That was before either of us ran up against whatever stalks the tree line behind his mother's house. Cal's land lies where Anderson County blurs into Oconee, a pocket of rolling pasture hemmed in by hardwood forest. From the paved road you see nothing but loblolly pine, sweet gum, and the corrugated metal roof of his old one-story place tucked into the greenery. The driveway splits after 100 yards. Left up to Bon's house. Bon is Calvin's mother, though half the county calls her that, and right toward Cal's. For the first months of our relationship he lived alone there, keeping a couple of goats and an old plot hound with a bark like an air raid siren. When we married he moved in with me and the children, but we never thought of selling the house. His job at the mill gives him odd days off, and it felt good to have somewhere out in the trees where we could escape on weekends. Let the kids fish the little farm pond. Let the city noise drain out of our bones. Bon loves seeing the children run through her yard, but she is a practical woman. The very first afternoon I brought the little ones over. She took me aside and delivered her warning in a voice pitched low enough the kids wouldn't hear. A couple of weeks earlier, she said. She had been hauling a watering can to the garden when something black and cat-like loped across the grass between her shed and the woods. Black as a cinder, longer than any farm dog, slick through the weeds like spilled oil. She swore the thing's back came past her hip. Bon isn't one for stories. She never exaggerates a fish's size or adds a ghost to a backroad's tale. So I paid attention. She said she didn't dare move until it faded into shadow and the leaves stopped shaking. Cal laughed it off when I told him. There are no panthers in South Carolina, he said. Not since the 19th century. The Department of Natural Resources insists the only wild cats out here are bobcats, and most of them run 25 pounds or less. I had once captured a tawny mountain lion on my trail cam in Greenwood County, but that was a single cat, dragging its broken toe through clay, half-starved and probably somebody's illegal pet turned loose. Black panthers are things of legend, old wet nurse stories, Calvin said with that grin of his. But Bon's warning stuck to the edges of my mind. I started telling the children never to go anywhere near the woods after sunset. Better safe than sorry. In early spring, When the redbuds were blooming and the air smelled of cut hay, I asked Calvin if he would take me deer hunting behind his place. I grew up with rifles and tree stands, but most of my seasons since the divorce had blurred by with no chance to hunt. Cal jumped at the idea. Bon agreed to keep the kids for the afternoon, promised she'd feed them chili and cornbread. By 2 o'clock Cal and I had our rifles slung, day packs filled with jerky and a dented kookaburra flask, and boots laced tight. The sky was unblemished Carolina blue. The air tasted like river rock cooled in shadow. The path begins at the back corner of his fence line, a wagon rut-turned foot trail that winds through box elders, then climbs until the trees open into a tangle of beech and poplar. We walked quietly, stopping when a squirrel flicked its tail on a branch above us, pausing to study turkey scratch marks in the sandy soil. By 3:30 we reached a natural pinch point where the land rises in a narrow saddle between two gullies. Cal leaned his marlin against a tulip poplar, and I wedged my .270 across a root and settled into the deadfall. The forest hummed with cicadas. Sunlight dappling the leaves made the ground look alive. Time in the woods stretches like melted glass. We sat so long my feet tingled. Once a pair of does ghosted past, bounced the ridge, and vanished. A gray squirrel chattered 10 yards away. But the afternoon gave no bucks, and an hour before dusk Calvin suggested moving to a second stand on the far side of the property. Closer, he said, to something he wanted to show me. You mean the old well? I asked. I had seen the stone rim once from a distance. Better, he said, and grinned. A burial ground. Bones older than the state of South Carolina. Now a sane person might balk at the idea of visiting graves at twilight, but I am a student of Southern folklore. If an abandoned graveyard sat back in these trees, I wanted it etched in memory. We gathered rifles and walked deeper, crossing a trickling creek called Devil Fork. The name pricked my skin. Creeks earn their names for reasons. When we stepped from the main trail into the hardwoods, the air changed. You can't see the difference so much as feel it, the drop in temperature, the way the sunlight dies under thick crown shade. Cal led, using his rifle barrel to lift briars. After a football field's worth of weaving, he stopped and drew a semicircle in the leaves with his boot. Here. My own question came back. Warped. What the heck? Same syllables, my cadence, but papery, weary, wrong. Panic flooded. I managed. What do you want? The voice answered. I want you to leave. My tongue felt numb. I stepped back. Humor sparked, a reflex against horror, and I muttered, okay, sure thing, then turned and sprinted. Something followed, not pounding like a bear, but pacing with a lazy confidence, gaining without effort. I snatched a rock, half the size of a baseball, hurled it behind. A roar followed, like a man, a deer, a bull elk sharing one throat. Sound vibrated the marrow of my bones. A blow struck my shoulder, flinging me against a pine. My right ankle twisted under me. Agony flashed. I landed on my back gasping. Above, the skull face tilted, yellow eyes burning. Rank breath, fetid meat and swamp water washed over me. Leave now, it shrieked inches away. Terror cracked into anger. Some animal or demon thought me prey. In a surge of adrenaline I rolled, staggered up, screamed, I will not die today, and fled. Pain vanished under raw survival. The creature circled, tried to block, but I dodged branches, zigzagged, saw porch lights flicker through the dusk. I burst from woods, slammed the back door, and heard the thing crash against siding. Walls trembled. A second later, silence fell. Upstairs I stripped muddy clothes, wrapped my swollen ankle, told my father only that some lunatic chased me. His eyes narrowed, sensing the lie, but he let it pass. That night sleep came fitful. I half-dreamed screeches outside windows, saw yellow eyes float like candles in blackness. Weeks passed. I avoided the woods. My ankle healed. School marched onward. I pretended normality. At dinner we discussed college applications. Mom worried about tuition. Dad joked about scholarships. I nodded, smiled when needed. A month later, anger over calculus almost nudged me toward that tree line again. Instead, I closed my textbook and stared through my window into the dark mass of forest. Moonlight glazed the first rows of trunks. Nothing moved, yet I couldn't shake the certainty that somewhere deeper inside, something tall watched, patient, unhungry now but not finished. I imagined it stroking earth with split hooves, sniffing night air, memorizing the rhythm of my breathing through glass. The woods remain, tracks vanish in rain, but I know the path where paw prints turned human, where hooves walked like men, where a deer skull glowed with stolen speech. I have no theories that fit science, no tidy ending where the monster dies, no revelation of ancient folklore or curses, only memories. The hush, the mimicry, the eyes. I study harder these days, not because grades determine everything, but because logic feels safer than wonder. Yet sometimes during midnight equations, I hear wind drag across the eaves and I remember the voice that spoke my sentence back to me, thin as a worn photograph. What the heck? I keep the curtains closed now. I double knot my boot laces each morning. And I stay clear of the creek behind our house where the mud still holds shapes imagination insists on explaining away. At first all I saw were flat stones, slabs no wider than cookpots, some flush with soil, others tilted by roots. The arrangement looked too random for headstones until my eyes adjusted. Each slab sat north-south, each within spitting distance of its neighbor. Half the markers leaned like pitched roofs, half rested level. No names, no dates, just limestone covered in fern spores and spider silk. Reverend Miller at my home church says in old days Cherokee sometimes burned the markers so no enemy tribe could identify the dead. These slabs looked as though fire had kissed them centuries ago. Cal's voice dropped as if the bones might still hear. He told me a previous landowner uncovered a clay pot somewhere nearby and found ash inside. He reburied it, then built fence rows around the area, as if to keep cattle from trampling what should be left alone. The fences were long rotted now, only the rocks remained. I felt no dread in that first moment, only quiet sadness, the way I do inside small-town cemeteries where the dates on headstones are all children. But Calvin wanted to explore the creek bed before dark. He'd found evidence someone upstream had dammed the flow. He asked if I cared to come. My lungs felt raw from spring pollen, and I wanted a rest, so I shook my head. Go on, I told him. I'll stay with the rifles. You sure? I'm breathing, aren't I? I joked, and sat against a hickory trunk. Cal eased between twin pines and was gone. I listened to his footsteps die away. A flicker of wind rustled leaves. Then the heavy quiet settled. At first I did what every solitary hunter does. I tried to make my body still, to still even my heartbeat so nature would forget me. 5 minutes in I realized something was wrong. The stillness felt thick, thicker than stillness should. My gut prickled. It was that unnerving hush you hear in an empty house late at night, when refrigerator hum and distant car tires vanish, and the silence pounds louder than noise ever could. My skin crawled. Fear slid through my veins like cold grease. I gripped the stock of my rifle and scanned the shadows. Nothing moved, and yet everything felt watchful, conscious, malicious. I have felt demonic presence once in my life. Years ago when a dark thing drifted into my home and rattled dishes at night. The dread filling my lungs now matched that memory note for note. I forced breath deep, tried prayer, but words came out cottonmouth thick. A branch snapped 50 yards left. I jerked the barrel that direction. Nothing. Again snap farther right. My pulse hammered. Blood thundered so loud the woods should have echoed it. Then a voice spoke my name. Soft, casual, as if Calvin called from behind my shoulder. Relief surged. I'd imagined all the dread. I started to turn, then froze. The voice had come from the wrong side. Cal had gone upstream to my right. The voice whispered from my left. Before I processed that, the voice spoke again, same tone, same volume, from the original direction. Ping-ponged. Left, right, left, like two invisible men on opposite sides calling just beyond sight. I wheeled, muzzle leading, but saw only layered darkness. The smell hit me. Sweet rot, musk thick enough to choke. My guts iced. I knew bona fide spiritual evil wore that stink. From the brush directly before me came a shape. human tall but too narrow, blurry edges, as if darkness congealed. It stepped within 20 yards, yet I could not discern features, only the sense of upright posture and the shimmer of something wet where a face should be. The rifle trembled so bad the barrel jerked side to side. "Briar!" The voice moaned my name again from behind. The shadow ahead tilted, almost curious. I squeezed the trigger half a pound from firing. The safety was on or off. I can't remember now because I never fired. The shadow faded back 2 steps like smoke drawn on a sudden draft. In that instant Calvin crashed through brush from the creek trail, shouting for me. I whipped the barrel away from him fast enough to make both our hearts choke. He raised palms. "It's me," he rasped. I looked over his shoulder. Nothing. The dread smell thinned. Cicadas buzzed again overhead as though someone had lifted a lid off the forest. "What's wrong?" Cal asked, voice rattling. I told him pieces, not all. I said I'd felt watched, heard voices calling my name. He frowned, shrugged. He had gotten lost, he admitted. The creek meandered, and somehow he climbed the wrong bank and doubled back. He'd never been disoriented on his own property before. He laughed it off, tried to seem amused, but his hands when he shouldered his rifle shook. We walked home through growing dusk. I kept glancing behind us. Nothing followed, yet I sensed something, someone, hovering just at the line of visibility, curious but not daring daylight. That week, oddness multiplied. Twice I woke in Cal's bedroom to the sound of heavy steps scrambling on the roof. Tin gutters rattled like a fox loose among hens. Each time the terrier slept through, Cal snored gently. I lay motionless, praying the thing would pass. Another night, when Calvin tinkered in his garage, he burst inside pale, said he'd heard a scream in the woods like an infant being slaughtered. We argued whether bobcats scream that way. He insisted it was no bobcat. The scream repeated as he spoke, distant but ear-splitting. One afternoon I saw a silhouette in the hallway. Taller than any man, hatless, shoulders hunched. It slid from the guest bedroom toward the back door without sound. I chased but found nothing, only the screen swaying in its frame though no breeze blew. And always the smell, faint when day shone, strong when dusk pooled under the eaves. Rotten fruit, wet fur, old ashes. Cal remained skeptical but uneasy. Bon kept her distance, though once I noticed her sprinkling something. Maybe salt, maybe holy water, along her back threshold. She claimed it was moth powder. Only weeks later, after more roof steps and more nightmares, did I tell Calvin everything. The shapeless shadow in the Indian stones, the name-calling voices, the sense we had attracted attention. He listened, frowning, but his doubt persisted. He found comfort in natural explanations. Big cats, coyotes, maybe pranksters from down the road. I found no comfort anywhere. Summer ripened. Humidity clung like a second skin. One night thunderheads boiled from the west, lightning flickering silent purple behind the hills. I stood on our borrowed porch while Cal stacked scrap pallet wood in the fire barrel. The kids slept inside with fans humming. I felt eyes beyond the security light's halo. Cicadas hushed mid-song. The lightning flickered again, showing tree trunks like bones. A figure detached from the shadows, blackest black, tall as the deck roof. It stepped across gravel. The light failed under its approach, as if brightness recoiled. My mouth froze open. The figure glided toward the barn, silent except for an electric buzzing in my ears. It raised a limb or arm or paw and laid it against the siding. Tin groaned beneath claw rise. Calvin's back was turned. I tried to speak, no sound. The figure looked at me. No eyes, yet I felt its gaze, and vanished, parted into mist. The security light flicked bright again. Cicadas resumed. I found breath and called. Caleb turned, looked where I pointed, saw nothing. His face twisted. He thought me overtired, overheated. I dragged him to the barn wall. There, across galvanized paneling, ran for fresh gouges, each a foot long, steel curled outward like peeled fruit skin. He exhaled. Neither of us spoke because words break fragile composure. We slept that night with weighted blankets, each dreaming of black cats with human voices. The next Sunday, I brought the children home after church and found Calvin on our porch steps, sawdust in his hair. He had nailed cedar planks across every window, had hung a new deadbolt on the door, had printed a psalm in black marker on a strip of plywood and mounted it over the lintel. I said nothing. Sometimes building keeps fear at bay. The smell vanished after that. Claw marks faded to rust. Step sounds ceased, though I can't say the dread left. Some summer nights, long after kids sleep, I feel a hush ripple through the pines and I remember flattened gravestones under vine choke. A voice speaking my name in two directions at once. We have not walked to the burial ground again. One day the kids will beg to explore, and maybe I will guide them there at noon, when sunlight burns hard and nothing whispers. I will show them stones and teach them to tread soft over anyone's resting place. When they ask about mountain lions, I will say maybe not, better safe near the yard lights. I will hide the rest of the story behind my teeth, because some memories are burdens, and children deserve to run fearless a little longer. As for Bond's black cat, whether cougar, ghost, or devil wearing fur, I no longer doubt she saw what she says. Our state handbook may insist we share no forests with panthers, but the handbook never spent dusk at the stones of forgotten ancestors. Something prowls those woods. It can mimic voices. It can part light like water. It can claw tin deeper than any bear. Whether it is demon or skinwalker or some creature science has yet to name hardly matters. It owns the tree line, and I will keep my children well inside that border after dark. The next time its eyes find me, I intend to meet them from behind locked doors and prayer, not alone among roots and rock. Calvin still laughs sometimes about Bond's warning, but his laugh ends sooner these days. At night, I catch him staring out the bedroom window as if waiting for footsteps on metal, listening for leaves to still. Perhaps one day I'll invite my father to circle the house with oil and scripture. Until then I keep faith, keep my children close, and watch shadows slide through pine needles under the moon. The forest may never speak its true name, but the heart knows when something out there has teeth, and the heart never forgets the sound of danger calling your name in a voice you recognized as your own husband's echo. My fiancé tried to distract me by buying a second-hand console so we could play horror games. He claimed facing fictional monsters might cure my fear by oversaturating it. Perhaps the plan would have worked if we had not also replayed the old recordings about skinwalkers for research, laughing at how we once teased them. One evening we finished a session and left the balcony doors open to welcome a breeze that smelled of dust from nearby construction. He stepped outside to smoke, then called my name. I assumed he wanted a drink, but his voice trembled. I found him staring up at the dark. A shape leaned over the 7th floor ledge opposite ours. A silhouette deeper than night, head cocked, horns glinting in street lamp glare. Before I could speak, it melted backward, vanishing against the rooftop tanks. We shut doors, locked windows, turned off lights, and huddled in the bedroom. Wind rattled aluminum rails. Something scraped glass twice, then silence. The following day we discovered faint smears. Mud, soot. On the outer side of the pane, far beyond any human's reach without a scaffold. We cleaned them with bleach and resolved not to mention them to the landlord. When friends asked why we stopped gaming late, we lied about early work shifts. Weeks slipped by. My fiancé traveled for business, leaving me alone. The first night after he flew, I lay in bed at 2 a.m. when 3 distinct taps clicked above my headboard, on the wall separating me from the corridor. I held my breath. The taps moved to the wardrobe doors, then the ceiling fan, then the floor beneath the bed as though something phased through solid matter, testing boundaries. I whispered prayers until dawn painted the curtains gray. In hazy exhaustion next morning, I convinced myself it was water pipes. 2 nights later, the power failed across the suburb. I lit a candle and paced the lounge. The balcony slider rattled though no breeze entered. For the briefest moment I saw a face pressed against the glass. Eyes flat, colorless, mouth a gash of black within black. I imagine some readers may think I hallucinated under stress. Perhaps. Yet the next morning when electricity returned, dusty prints identical to those on the farm veranda marked the balcony tiles. Twin slots, weight centered on the front of each step. I phoned my mother. She urged me to call the pastor again, yet I felt ashamed, as though my own curiosity had invited doom a second time. I scrubbed the floor, poured salt across the threshold, and taped verses to the sill. That night nothing happened. The following evening, faint scratching resumed on the roof. 6th floor, no overhanging branches, just steel girders and corrugated sheets. I told myself cats roam any height. Another month passed without major incident. Then my fiancé returned. We tried to treat ourselves to a normal city date. Fried chicken, cheap cinema, laughter at the ridiculous dubbing of an imported action film. That night, while he showered, I went to close the balcony door and saw movement behind the curtain, like someone standing between fabric and glass. I expected to find my own reflection, yet when I drew the cloth aside, there was nothing but streetlights wobbling in heat haze. Something brushed my shoulder. I spun. Shadow slid across the hall toward the bedroom. Tall, stooped, blacker than absence. The bathroom door opened. My fiancé stepped out, dripping, wearing a towel. He saw my face, followed my gaze. Nothing there. I lost my nerve and told him everything. Every tap, every scrape, every hoofprint. He took me seriously at last. Perhaps because he remembered the night he saw a shape on the balcony. Perhaps my shaking voice was proof. He searched forums about demons, about skinwalkers, about ancient curses and jinn. Each entry contradicted the next. One neighbor suggested we burn sage. Another recommended a sangoma in Soweto. We drove to her the next day. She listened to every detail, then spoke quietly. You named a spirit. You called it. It follows you because you taste familiar. She provided herbs to burn and instructed us to apologize aloud to the night for speaking without respect. We obeyed. The smell of burnt leaves curled through the unit. For several nights afterwards, the tapping stopped. Yet 3 weeks ago, while drifting toward sleep, I felt pressure at the mattress foot, as if someone placed a hand near my ankle. The curtain lifted though windows were shut. From the living room, a single hollow knock, identical to the call we heard by the dam, echoed down the hallway. I recited Psalm 91 until sunrise and made plans to visit my mother that weekend. Back on the farm, everything looked calmly ordinary. Children played soccer in dusty shorts. Chickens scratched for termites. But when twilight bled out beyond the power lines, I could sense it again, that wine-thick silence. My nephew, older now and quick with caution, kept the younger ones inside. I sat beneath the porch light, holding a mug, telling myself nothing would appear as long as the pastor's blessings remained on doorframes. The dogs slept. The cattle stirred once, twice. No tapping came. I dared to hope the worst had passed. At midnight a storm brewed to the south, grumbling. I walked across the yard to check a dripping tap. Halfway there, wind snapped dry maize leaves and carried a smell that does not belong in thunderstorms. Sulfur mixed with rot. I turned, glance sweeping the fence line. At the exact spot where the borehole pump stands, a figure waited. Taller than before, maybe because it stood straight, showing long arms that nearly brushed its knees. Between 2 lightning flashes, I saw the face. Furry like a jackal but hairless around the mouth, revealing serrated teeth that glowed faintly. And the eyes were familiar, relentless coals burning through rain. I stepped backward, whispering an apology I had rehearsed. I was foolish to call you. Go without harm. Leave all here unharmed. The creature tilted its head as if puzzled, then retreated a single step. Lightning flashed. It was gone. That same second the wind died. Insects restarted their hum. My senses flooded with ordinary night smells. Wet soil, cattle dung, with smoke drifting from Ruku's cooking fires. I ran inside. Since that night, no tapping on windows, no prints in soil, no barking fits. The Sangoma told me the creature may appear again if I speak of it with mockery. So I write these words not to mock but to warn. Some beings, once named, cross oceans whether you believe they belong here or not. They cloak themselves in old fears and new geographies. Maybe it was never truly a skinwalker or a demon. Maybe it was something nameless wearing that mask. Whatever it is, my family will no longer joke aloud beneath the acacias. My nephew no longer blasts horror podcasts while fixing fences. And each time I put down food scraps for the dogs, I whisper gratitude to whatever holds the night at the edge of the yard, because I remember the silence that swallows crickets, and I know how easily that silence can return. I do not pretend to understand the laws that govern the unseen. A scientist would ask for photographs, measurements, DNA from strange footprints. I have only recollections. The sour stench of decay, the shape pressing against balcony glass 6 stories above ground, the echo of my own name called from 2 directions at once. If you choose to dismiss these memories, I take no offense. Skepticism is a shield of its own. Yet I urge you, whether you hunt monsters in podcasts or simply tell spooky stories around a fire, be careful whom you invite, even in jest. The world is wide, and the borders between realms may be thinner than the distance between one breath and the next thunderclap. For now, life continues. The cattle must eat, the maize must be weeded, the city job calls me back each Monday. But when dusk rolls across the fields, my feet know the way to the veranda's bright pool of light, and my eyes scan every shadow past the last gate. Somewhere out there, something restless remembers the sound of 2 careless people laughing under an African sun, and I will never forget the lesson. A story may end, but the listener still waits on the far side of the trees. I stepped backward, whispering an apology I had rehearsed. I was foolish to call you. Go without harm. Leave all here unharmed. The creature tilted its head as if puzzled, then retreated a single step. Lightning flashed. It was gone. That same second the wind died. Insects restarted their hum. My senses flooded with ordinary night smells. Wet soil, cattle dung, with smoke drifting from Rukus cooking fires. I ran inside. Since that night, no tapping on windows, no prints in soil, no barking fits. The Sangoma told me the creature may appear again if I speak of it with mockery. So I write these words not to mock but to warn. Some beings, once named, cross oceans whether you believe they belong here or not. They cloak themselves in old fears and new geographies. Maybe it was never truly a skinwalker or a demon. Maybe it was something nameless wearing that mask. Whatever it is, my family will no longer joke aloud beneath the acacias. My nephew no longer blasts horror podcasts while fixing fences. And each time I put down food scraps for the dogs, I whisper gratitude to whatever holds the night at the edge of the yard, because I remember the silence that swallows crickets, and I know how easily that silence can return. I do not pretend to understand the laws that govern the unseen. A scientist would ask for photographs, measurements, DNA from strange footprints. I have only recollections. The sour stench of decay, the shape pressing against balcony glass 6 stories above ground, the echo of my own name called from 2 directions at once. If you choose to dismiss these memories, I take no offense. Skepticism is a shield of its own. Yet I urge you, whether you hunt monsters in podcasts or simply tell spooky stories around a fire, be careful whom you invite, even in jest. The world is wide, and the borders between realms may be thinner than the distance between one breath and the next thunderclap. For now, life continues. The cattle must eat, the maize must be weeded, the city job calls me back each Monday. But when dusk rolls across the fields, my feet know the way to the veranda's bright pool of light, and my eyes scan every shadow past the last gate. Somewhere out there, something restless remembers the sound of 2 careless people laughing under an African sun, and I will never forget the lesson. A story may end, but the listener still waits on the far side of the trees.